When I was 7, my family lived in this old 2-story house on the outskirts of town. It was one of those places with creaky floorboards and wallpaper that peeled at the corners, like the house had been trying to shed its skin for years. That night, I wasn't in my usual room. My little brother had caught some kind of stomach bug, and Mom didn't want me to get sick too, so I was moved into the guest room. It had a twin bed against the wall and a small wooden dresser with a broken knob. The window faced the backyard, which had one of those wire fences that barely stood up straight anymore. I remember waking up in the middle of the night. Not sure what time it was, but it was dark. Like pitch black dark, except for the little blue glow from the nightlight in the hallway. At first, I thought the scraping sound I heard was from a tree branch brushing the window. The wind had picked up earlier that day. But as I opened my eyes and sat up, I realized it wasn't coming from the window itself. It was inside the room, near the corner. There was this shape, just barely visible in the dark. It wasn't shaped like anything I recognized. It was low at first, then seemed to rise, slowly. I remember thinking it was darker than everything else, like it was blocking out the shadows instead of blending into them. I didn't scream. I didn't move either. I just watched it. The only sound was this deep breathing, slow and heavy. It didn't sound like a person, and it didn't sound like any animal I knew. It just stood there for a moment and then moved, kind of glided toward the window. Then it was gone. No noise after that. Just silence. I laid back down and stared at the ceiling until the hallway light turned on, and I heard Mom walking around. At the time, I felt more curious than anything. I thought maybe I had dreamed it, but it didn't feel like a dream. When I looked the next morning, nothing had moved in the room. Nothing looked touched. But I still remember the sound of that breathing. That wasn't the only weird thing happening in the house back then. My little brother Tommy was 4, and he started talking a lot about someone he called the man in the hat. He'd say things like, "He came again last night," or "He watches me from the corner." At first we thought it was just his imagination, but it started happening too often. He wouldn't want to go to bed unless the closet was open, which was the opposite of how most kids are. Sometimes late at night, we'd hear footsteps on the roof. We lived on the edge of a small subdivision, no trees high enough for branches to reach, and no attic access from outside. But it would sound like someone walking up there, slow and deliberate. Dad even went up with a flashlight once, but didn't find anything. No tracks, no loose shingles. Other times, the doorknob on the front door would rattle gently, like someone trying to turn it slowly. Not in a way that you'd notice if you weren't sitting in the living room quietly. But Mom and I were watching TV one night when we both heard it. Dad went out with a baseball bat and came back in annoyed, saying the wind probably shook it. But there was no wind that night. The worst were the voices. You'd hear a giggle, or the sound of someone talking in a normal tone, like a casual conversation, but the room would be empty. Upstairs mostly. Always upstairs. One time I was brushing my teeth and heard laughing behind me in the hallway. I turned off the water and called for Tommy, thinking maybe he was playing a prank, but the hallway was empty and dark. I walked into his room. He was asleep, curled up on his side with a bunch of stuffed animals. I told Mom about it and she just nodded. Didn't even ask questions. That's when I noticed she and Dad were getting more quiet about stuff. They stopped brushing it off so easily. If Tommy mentioned the man in the hat, they'd just exchange a look and change the subject. One night I overheard them in the kitchen. Dad was saying something like, "Maybe we should just move. These old places always have problems." Mom didn't respond right away. Then she said, "It's not the pipes, Greg. Pipes don't make kids talk to walls." After that, Dad started staying up later, drinking coffee in the garage and leaving the light on in the hallway. The guest room I'd slept in that night got turned into storage, boxes stacked up in front of the closet door. We weren't allowed to play in there anymore. Tommy started sleeping in our parents' room more often. He'd wake up screaming sometimes, clutching at Mom's arm, saying the man was standing by the dresser. One night he bit his own tongue in his sleep and woke up crying with blood on his pillow. Mom just held him and rocked back and forth on the edge of their bed, whispering, "It's okay. You're safe." But she didn't look convinced. That was the last time he slept in his own room. When I was 8, we moved to a brand new house across town. It had shiny floors, clean white walls, and a smell like fresh paint and unopened boxes. I remember being excited. Everything felt calm for a little while. No creaks, no peeling wallpaper, no drafty hallways. My parents smiled more during the first few weeks, trying to act like things were finally normal again. I started school with new kids, and Tommy had his own bedroom with big windows and a rocket ship lamp on his nightstand. We thought that maybe, finally, we had left all the strange things behind. But it didn't take long. Maybe 3 weeks in, Tommy started waking up at night again, saying the man in the hat had found him. He'd cry and ask to sleep in my room. One night I let him. He sat up in bed staring at the closet and whispering that he saw him there, pointing. I told him to go back to sleep, that it was just a coat or a shadow from the hall light. But I stayed awake that whole night, watching the closet door. I never saw anything, but I kept hearing that slow, deep breathing again, like someone was standing just behind the closet door, not moving, just breathing. A few nights later, I heard the front door handle jiggling again, not fast, like someone in a hurry. Slow, careful turns, like someone testing if it was locked. Mom started locking her bedroom door at night. Dad stayed up in the garage again, but now the garage was attached to the house, and I noticed he'd keep the door to the kitchen propped open with a paint can. Sometimes I'd wake up and hear him moving around at 2 or 3 a.m., like he was walking laps in the hallway. One night, I got up for water and caught him standing at the top of the stairs in the dark, just standing still. When he realized I was there, he just said, "Go back to bed," without turning around. There were other things too. Once I heard someone laughing in the laundry room when no one was there. I'd catch glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, just flickers of black darting past a doorway. Tommy got quieter. He stopped drawing in his sketch pad and started sleeping with the light on. At school, teachers started asking if everything was okay at home. I heard Mom on the phone a lot, always whispering in the bathroom with the door closed. She looked tired, like she wasn't sleeping at all. By the time I turned 10, the weirdness had become part of our lives. I'd still flinch if I heard breathing too close to my ear while I was alone in my room. Tommy still talked about the man in the hat, but only when we were by ourselves. He said the man would crouch in the corner and not say anything. Just watch. My parents started asking us strange questions, like if anyone had been following us on the way home from school, or if we'd seen anyone near the house. At dinner, they barely looked at each other. Mom kept her phone nearby like she was waiting for a call. Dad would leave halfway through meals, saying he forgot something in the garage. The events never got worse, but they didn't stop. They just wore us down. The tension stayed in the walls of that perfect modern house. Then slowly, everything started quieting down. The incidents kept happening regularly for about 2 more years. After that, they began to fade. No more laughing in empty rooms. No more footsteps in the attic. The closet doors stopped creaking open at night. Tommy didn't mention the Hat Man anymore. He just stopped one day. By the time I turned 11, the house was quiet in a way it hadn't been since we moved in. We could sleep through the night again. It felt like waking up from a long dream where you didn't realize you were dreaming until it ended. When I was 12, my parents got divorced. There wasn't a big fight or a single moment where everything fell apart. It just unraveled. One weekend, Dad moved into a small apartment on the other side of town. During the custody hearings, I overheard things that made some of the past years start to make more sense. Mom saying she never knew where he was half the time. That he'd say he had night shifts, but he wasn't on any schedule. That he disappeared during family events and wouldn't answer his phone. There were mentions of someone else. Someone she had found out about. Those work meetings he claimed to have late at night. The nights he paced the hallway and kept the door to the garage open. The front door rattling. The footsteps. The heavy breathing. Maybe it was him, moving around quietly, coming in and out when he thought no one would notice. Maybe he was hiding things from all of us, not just Mom. Maybe the monsters we imagined weren't imagined at all, just misunderstood versions of what we didn't yet know how to explain. Looking back now, I don't think what we experienced was paranormal. I think we were just two kids caught in the slow, painful collapse of a family. Our young minds couldn't understand why things felt wrong, why our house felt heavy, why our parents whispered and locked doors and avoided each other's eyes. We didn't know how to name betrayal, or mistrust, or secrets, so our minds gave us something we could name. A man in a hat. Footsteps. Breathing. Something that made sense to a child. The breathing I heard could have been my own, echoing in my head while I lay awake in fear. The voices might have come from a TV left on in another room, or from my parents fighting softly behind closed doors. The shadow in the closet? A coat on a hanger, swaying in the air from the heating vent. We weren't haunted by ghosts. We were haunted by confusion, loneliness, and the things adults think kids are too young to notice. What scares me most now isn't that we saw something. It's how fully a house can absorb a family's stress and turn it into something children can't help but feel. It's how easy it is for a home to become unrecognizable when trust starts to rot. We didn't see ghosts. We saw what was left in the silence. We felt what no one would say out loud. Sometimes the scariest thing isn't what hides in the dark. It's what lives right in front of you, pretending everything is fine. So I was working my usual night shift streaming games from my home setup in the suburbs outside Seattle. It was a quiet Wednesday, I think, and I'd just cracked open a Red Bull around 2:45 a.m. My girlfriend Katie had gone to bed maybe 2 hours earlier. I remember her saying something about being tired from work and reminding me not to scream into the mic because our walls weren't that thick. I was halfway through playing this new low-budget horror game with a weird VHS filter and cheap jump scares. Chat was active. I had around 50 viewers, and I was joking around, trying to make it fun. It was one of those chill, nothing really happens kind of nights. Around 3:05 a.m., the game was getting boring, and I was thinking about switching. That's when I heard a door creak behind me. At first I thought it was from the game, but then I saw Katie standing in the hallway, backlit by the bathroom nightlight. She looked pale, and her eyes were wide. She walked in fast and whispered, "Someone's at the front door." I took off my headset. I could hear it too. This soft, slow, rattling noise. It wasn't loud, more like someone trying the handle just hard enough to test it, but not enough to force it. We both stood there for a second. I muted my mic and told the viewers I'd be right back. I followed her down the hallway toward the front room. Our house is a small one-story, just a narrow entryway, kitchen, living room, and a few bedrooms. We keep the lights off at night except in the kitchen. The front door has one of those battery-powered security cams with a little IR light, and I pulled up the app on my phone. The motion alert was already there, time-stamped 3:02 a.m. I tapped the live feed, and the image popped up, grainy but clear enough. A woman was standing there, facing the door. Just standing. Not moving. Not knocking. Just waiting. She looked around 40 or 50, wearing a zip-up jacket and jeans. No mask, no gloves. Her hair was pulled back in a ponytail. She wasn't carrying anything. Just standing with her arms hanging loosely at her sides, looking directly at the peephole. I turned on the intercom speaker and said, "Hello?" Her head moved slightly, like she'd been startled. Then she stepped closer, too close to the camera. "Hi," she said. "I'm so sorry. I think I have the wrong house. I'm looking for my brother, Michael." Her voice cracked a bit, like she was either cold or nervous. I asked what address she was looking for, and she said ours, full number and street. She sounded confused. Said she hadn't been here in years and that Michael had just moved recently. She went on about how he worked in construction, drove a black F-150, and lived with a woman named Jenna, or Jessa. She gave so much detail. Too much. It wasn't like someone knocking randomly. She acted like she was supposed to be here. I told her nobody by that name lived here. Katie stood behind me, arms crossed, watching the screen. The woman shifted her weight, looked down the street like she was expecting someone to walk up. Then she asked if she could come in and use our phone. Said her battery had died and she was stranded. I told her I could call someone for her. A cab, a tow truck, whatever. But she shook her head. "No, it's fine. I'll just come in for a second. I'll be quick." I repeated myself. Said I wasn't comfortable with that, but would help however I could from outside. She stepped back a little, rubbed her arms like she was cold. She looked up at the camera again and said, "Can I at least get a glass of water? I've been walking for hours." At this point, Katie whispered, "This feels wrong. Just call the cops." But the woman didn't look dangerous. She looked tired, maybe a little off, but not threatening. I told her to wait and locked the deadbolt, just in case, then walked back to my setup and muted the stream entirely. I called a local cab company and gave them our address and a vague description of the woman. They said it'd be about 15 minutes. When I returned to the hallway, Katie was still watching the feed. The woman hadn't left. She was just pacing slowly on the front porch, pausing now and then to look at the street. I told her a taxi was on the way, and she said, "Thanks. Sorry to bother you." Then she sat down on the steps, just outside the camera's lower frame. We couldn't see her clearly now, just the top of her head. Every few seconds she'd shift a little, like she was glancing up at the door. I waited with Katie by the window, both of us whispering to keep our voices low. 10 minutes passed. No car, no movement. I started getting that gut feeling that this wasn't just someone confused or lost. Something wasn't right. I pulled up the app again to see if she was still there. The feed took a second to load. When it did, she was gone. Just gone. I unlocked the door, cracked it open, and leaned out. The porch was empty. I stepped out slowly, scanning both ends of the street. Nothing. No footsteps, no cars, no sign of her. I walked down the steps and checked behind the bushes. Nothing. I looked over at the neighbor's house, wondering if maybe she'd gone there, but their lights were off. Katie stood in the doorway behind me, arms crossed, staring hard at the street. That's when I heard it. A voice, soft and close, coming from the side of the house. "Michael?" I froze when I heard her voice say, "Michael?" from the side of the house. It wasn't loud, but it was clear. Katie backed up into the house and pulled the door halfway shut behind her. I stepped off the porch, moving toward the side yard that ran between our place and the neighbor's fence. It was dark there. We hadn't replaced the side light bulb in weeks. I turned on my phone's flashlight and aimed it along the gravel path. Nobody. I walked slowly, checking behind the trash bins and garden hose. Nothing. The side gate was locked from the inside, and I didn't hear any movement. I stood there a few seconds, trying to decide whether to go further, when I heard Katie call my name from inside. Her voice was tight. I jogged back around front and she pulled me in, locking the deadbolt again. "She's on the back camera now," Katie said. I pulled up the backyard feed. The woman was there, standing at the back fence, looking at the patio door. She wasn't doing anything, just staring, like she was waiting. I pressed the intercom for that camera and said, "Ma'am, the police are on their way. You need to leave." Her head tilted a little, like she was confused by my voice coming from behind her. Then she walked slowly back toward the side yard, out of view. Katie had already dialed 911. I stayed on the cameras, flipping between front, back, and side angles, trying to catch where she'd go next. She reappeared on the left side, in our driveway now, standing by Katie's car. She peered into the driver's window, hand cupped against the glass. Then she moved to mine. Same thing. No tools, no breaking in. Just looking. On the intercom again, I said loudly, "You need to leave. Now." No reaction. She started circling the house, slower this time, and I realized she was counting windows. She'd stop, look in, move to the next one. When she reached the kitchen window, she stood there a long time. That one didn't have a curtain. Katie grabbed a knife from the drawer. Not dramatic, just something to hold while we waited. She started talking again, this time louder, as if to herself but clearly meant for us. "He said it was this house. He said the kitchen faced the street." She turned and looked straight at the camera. "Why are you pretending not to know me?" That's when Katie handed me the phone and went to double-check the back door. I gave the dispatcher every detail. Her clothes, behavior, what she was saying, how she'd been there nearly 15 minutes now. They said officers were en route. The woman walked away from the kitchen window and disappeared again. For a few minutes, we didn't see her. Katie stayed near the back of the house, watching that door. I stayed in the front room, lights off, phone in one hand, watching the feed. Then a motion alert popped up from the driveway camera. I tapped it. She was back by our cars, this time looking straight up at the house like she was trying to memorize the layout. I pressed the intercom again, said, "The police are coming. You need to leave now, or they'll find you here." She turned and walked out of the frame. 2 minutes later, headlights appeared at the end of our street. I watched as a patrol car pulled up, spotlight sweeping across our lawn. I opened the door just enough to wave them in. When they walked up, the woman was gone. The two officers spent 20 minutes walking the block, checking yards and side streets. They didn't find her. They told us we weren't the first to call about her. Apparently, several people on neighboring streets had reported a woman with similar stories. Always looking for a brother or cousin, always detailed, always trying to get inside. One of the officers said, "We've been getting these calls for a few nights now. She's not breaking in, but she's not harmless either." He suggested we keep all cameras recording and not to engage her next time. Just call immediately. After they left, Katie and I stayed up, going through the saved footage. She had looked in nearly every window. She had avoided the cameras at first, but once we confronted her, she started walking directly into their view like it didn't matter anymore. The next morning, Katie checked in with our neighbors. 2 of them had seen her in the past few days. One said she came to their door around 1 a.m. asking for her son. Another said she had stood in their yard during the day and took pictures of their mailbox and front door. That's when it clicked. She wasn't just confused. She was gathering information. Over the next few days, more people in the neighborhood started talking. The community Facebook group blew up. Posts from people describing the same woman, sometimes saying her name was Susan, other times Lisa. The stories always had different details. Always someone she was looking for. One guy down the street caught her on his Ring camera taking pictures of his garage and his kids' bikes. Finally, 5 days after our incident, the police caught her. She'd been staying in a beat-up minivan parked 3 blocks over near the edge of a park. Inside, they found notebooks, pages of names, addresses, car descriptions, photos printed from social media, notes on daily routines, when people left for work, what time lights went out. She hadn't been just wandering, she'd been planning. The police told us she had a history of mental health issues. No drugs, no weapons. She wasn't trying to rob anyone in the typical sense. She believed in her own way that these homes had something she needed. Resources. Shelter. Sometimes, she thought the people inside were family. Other times, she thought they owed her something. What scared us most was how real her stories sounded. She knew just enough truth, neighborhood layouts, common car models, local names, to almost get inside. Since then, we added more lights outside, new locks, and a better camera system. I still stream late at night, but I check the cameras more often. Katie doesn't sleep without the hallway light on now. We never saw her again after that, but for weeks, we both kept thinking we'd hear her voice through the door again, saying, "Michael?" Last year, I was renting this small studio apartment in downtown San Francisco while working at a tech startup. The place was pretty basic, single-room layout, old heater under the window, compact bathroom with yellowing tiles, but affordable by Bay Area standards. It was on the 5th floor of a building with an ancient elevator that groaned every time it moved. I didn't care much about the aesthetics. I spent most of my time at the office or glued to my laptop coding from the kitchen table. I was barely home long enough to notice anything weird, but after about 3 weeks, I started seeing little things that didn't add up. At first, it was food. Half a sandwich I was sure I'd wrapped in foil was just gone. A slice of pizza I left in a Tupperware was missing. Then, books on my shelf would be in slightly different positions. One time, a hardcover I hadn't touched in weeks was sitting on top of the others. Another day, I came back and found my air conditioning running. I clearly remembered turning it off before heading to work that morning. I figured I was just being forgetful. The startup job was intense. Long hours, lots of caffeine, very little sleep. Maybe I'd turned it on and didn't remember. But things kept happening. Every few days, something else would be off. A pen I'd left in my laptop bag was now sitting on the windowsill. My bathroom rug looked like it had been stepped on with wet feet, even though I hadn't showered since the previous night. I started thinking maybe there were mice, or maybe the building staff was coming in without saying anything, maintenance or something. I emailed my landlord and asked about it. He replied the next day, short and casual. "No maintenance scheduled. Our guys always notify tenants." So that ruled that out. I bought a few mouse traps and stuck them under the fridge, under the sink, in the corners of the bathroom. But they never got triggered. Not even once. So, no mice. I wasn't imagining these changes either. I started taking photos with my phone when I left for work. Shots of the kitchen, my shelves, the hallway by the door. When I got home, I'd check them. Sometimes everything looked the same. Other times, small differences. A chair moved slightly. A cabinet opened that had been closed. I thought about setting up a camera, but the place was so small it felt pointless. I'd just see myself walking around. Plus, I still leaned toward blaming myself. Stress, sleep deprivation. Maybe I really was just out of it. Then one night, around 2 a.m, I woke up feeling hot and sweaty. It was early August and the air was thick. I couldn't fall back asleep, so I decided to take a quick shower and try again. I usually showered in the morning, but the idea of cold water sounded good. My bathroom was tiny, maybe 6 feet long, with a narrow glass stall tucked into the back. The frosted glass door was cheap and warped. You could see blurry shapes through it if someone stood on the other side. I turned on the cold water, stepped in, and stood under the stream with my eyes closed. After a minute or so, I thought I saw something shift through the glass. Just a flicker, like the light dimmed briefly. I froze and turned my head toward the door, heart starting to beat faster. The bathroom light was right above the mirror, so any movement in front of the stall would cast shadows. I didn't hear anything, but I stood still and watched. For a few seconds, there was nothing. Then I saw it clearly. A silhouette. A person. Standing still just outside the glass door. I couldn't make out a face or features, just a solid human shape, not moving, not saying anything. Just standing there. My mouth went dry instantly. I didn't speak or move. I just stared through the foggy glass, trying to figure out what the hell I was seeing. The shape didn't move. I couldn't tell how long it had been there. I started running through everything in my head. How would someone get in? Had I locked the door? I always locked the door. There was no sound of the front door opening. No creaking floorboards. Nothing. But someone was standing outside the shower, close enough to touch the handle. I turned around fast and could see the reflection in the bathroom mirror. There was definitely a woman standing next to my shower door. My brain barely processed the image before I acted. I yanked the shower head from its holder and pointed it down toward the gap below the glass door. I turned the handle hard left, blasting scalding water under the door. She screamed, loud and sharp, and stumbled backward, crashing into the wall next to the sink. I could hear her shuffling and muttering, her bare feet slapping the tile. Her voice was angry, panicked, and muffled by the sound of the water still hitting the floor. I turned off the water and shouted that I was calling the cops. I grabbed my phone from the shelf near the sink, my hands dripping. I could hear her jiggling the bathroom door handle. Lucky for me, I always locked it by habit, even when I was home alone. She started pounding on the door, yelling at me to let her out, but I ignored it. My fingers were shaking as I dialed. I gave the dispatcher my address and told them someone had broken in and was trapped in my bathroom. The operator asked me to stay on the line and wait somewhere safe, so I backed away from the door, still wrapped in a wet towel, water dripping from my hair and feet. The only thing I could hear was the banging on the other side of the door and the occasional shout. I just sat down on the floor, cold, staring at the gap beneath the door, waiting for the police to arrive. They showed up in about 15 minutes. 2 officers came up the elevator, knocked, and called out before stepping inside. I pointed to the bathroom, still sitting on the floor, and told them she was locked inside. They moved quickly. One of them stood to the side while the other opened the door with a nod. The woman burst out, wide-eyed and soaked from the chest down, screaming something about how this was her place, and I was the one who needed to leave. She tried to push past them, but they grabbed her and pinned her arms. She struggled hard until one of them pulled something from her bag. A large kitchen knife wrapped in a towel. That shut everything down. The room went quiet, even her. They cuffed her and let her out. I just stood there watching her go. She didn't look at me. One of the officers asked if I was okay, if she had hurt me. I said no, and they nodded like they'd seen this kind of thing before. Then one of them explained who she was. Her name was Jennifer Clark. She was listed as the last tenant in the apartment. Apparently she'd been evicted 6 months earlier for not paying rent, but before leaving she'd made copies of the keys. She never turned them in, and the landlord never bothered changing the locks. For the last few weeks, maybe longer, she'd been letting herself in during the day while I was at work. She took food from my fridge, moved small things around, and slept there sometimes. The police guessed she'd learned my schedule well enough to know when to sneak in and out. They said I probably surprised her a few times without realizing it, which was why some things were only slightly disturbed. She'd been hiding. Closets, the bathtub, maybe even under the bed. The officer told me it wasn't uncommon in eviction cases when the tenant refused to fully move on. But the knife? That changed everything. It wasn't just trespassing. It was dangerous. Jennifer was arrested that night for breaking and entering, trespassing, and possession of a weapon. I gave a statement, filled out some paperwork, and by the time they left, it was almost 5 a.m. I didn't sleep. I just sat on the couch, every light on, trying to piece together the last month. Thinking about every weird thing I'd brushed off. That sandwich that went missing, the cold air blowing when I came home, the strange noise I once heard from inside the bathroom and chalked up to pipes. She'd been in my apartment. Not once or twice. Dozens of times. While I was gone. While I was asleep. The landlord came by later that morning. He looked pale and kept apologizing. Said he should have changed the locks after the eviction. Said it was policy, and he had no excuse. He called a locksmith that same hour. I watched the guy drill out the old locks and install brand new ones on both the front door and the sliding windows. I asked for extra bolts too. They didn't argue. The next week, I bought a camera. Motion triggered. I put one in the hallway facing the door and another in the main room. I couldn't sleep without checking the footage every morning. Took me a while to stop jumping at every sound, every creak in the floorboards. I moved out after my lease ended, but even now, in a different city, I still think about it sometimes. I think about how close she was. Just a wall away, or a door, or maybe even behind the couch while I worked on my laptop. I think about what might have happened if I hadn't locked the bathroom door that night, or if I hadn't seen her in the mirror, or if I hadn't grabbed the shower head in time. Now, anytime I move into a new place, I check every closet, every crawl space. I make sure all the locks are new, that every window closes fully. I don't care how paranoid it seems. I'd rather be paranoid than have someone like Jennifer living quietly in the background of my life again. Trust your instincts. If something feels off, it probably is. When I was 17, I was biking back from my friend Ryan's house around midnight on this backcountry road outside Salem. The fog had rolled in really thick that evening, making it impossible to see more than maybe 10 feet ahead. I decided to walk my mountain bike instead of riding, because I was worried about hitting a pothole or going off the road in the low visibility. The route went through some pretty isolated farmland, with houses spread far apart, and most of them were dark at that hour. I'd made this trip dozens of times before, but something about the fog made everything feel different and more isolated than usual. The only sounds were my footsteps on the asphalt and the occasional distant dog barking from one of the farms. It felt like I was walking through a tunnel of silence. The thick fog didn't just block the light. It seemed to absorb sound too. I remember looking back at one point and barely being able to see the faint red reflector on the back of my bike. It was that dense. My phone battery had died earlier in the night, so I had no flashlight. Just the weak light of the moon behind the fog, and whatever my eyes could adjust to. I kept my head low and focused on the road line. There were no streetlights, no cars, not even the buzz of insects. Just my shoes crunching gravel at the road's edge and the soft clunk of the bike chain swaying with every bump. I passed an old barn I recognized. It always looked abandoned. Usually I'd glance over at it for just a second and keep going, but this time something about it pulled my eyes. The upper window was slightly ajar, just a sliver, like someone had opened it to let smoke out. There wasn't any light, no movement, but I stared at that window until I had to force myself to keep walking. A few minutes later, I realized how quiet everything had gotten. Even the dogs had stopped barking. That was the first time I started to feel something off. Not fear exactly, but something close. About halfway home, I started hearing footsteps ahead of me that weren't mine. They had a different rhythm and sounded heavier, like someone wearing boots instead of my sneakers. At first, I figured it was just another person walking home late, maybe someone whose car had broken down. But when I called out hello to let them know I was behind them, the footsteps suddenly stopped completely. I kept walking forward, but never saw anyone emerge from the fog ahead of me. The silence felt wrong after hearing those clear footsteps just seconds before. I picked up my pace a little, feeling more alert than I had been earlier. I listened carefully while I walked, stopping every so often to check if I could hear the footsteps again. Nothing. Just my breathing and the sound of the gravel shifting under my tires as I rolled the bike beside me. At one point, I even stopped completely and waited, hoping whoever it was would say something or walk on ahead. But the fog stayed silent. I could feel my palms sweating on the handlebars. I tried to shake it off and kept telling myself it was just some farmer heading home. Maybe he cut through a field or turned down a drive I didn't see. Then I passed another mailbox, one I recognized as being close to the halfway point. Right as I passed it, I heard something else. This time it wasn't footsteps. It was the quick scrape of something being dragged across pavement. Short, sharp, then silence. Like someone moved a shovel or metal object a few feet and stopped. I turned around fast, but of course I couldn't see anything behind me through the fog. I tried to speak again, but my voice came out low, more like a whisper. "Hey, is someone there?" Still nothing. I waited a few seconds, then started walking again, a little faster now. I shifted my bike to the other side of me, putting it between myself and the sound. My legs were stiff, my ears straining for any hint of movement behind me. I hated that my phone was dead. I had no way to shine light, no way to call Ryan or anyone. I knew the road would curve left in about 100 yards, and once I hit that turn, I'd be near a streetlight at a junction. That became my goal. Just get to that bend. Keep moving. When I was maybe 20 feet from the curve, I heard the footsteps again. But this time they were behind me. Not fast, not running, just steady. Measured. I didn't look back. I just started walking faster. Then the dragging noise came again, only this time it didn't stop. It continued in short bursts. Scrape, pause, scrape, pause. It wasn't like someone stumbling. It was too deliberate. Like they were making sure I heard it. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination. Maybe an animal dragging something. Maybe someone pulling a garbage can down a driveway I couldn't see. But the road I was on had no driveways for at least another half-mile. Nothing but fields. I kept moving forward, holding the bike tighter, wishing it wasn't so quiet out here. I stopped just before the curve and listened hard, my heart pounding in my ears. The footsteps had stopped again, but the fog behind me felt too still. I wanted to turn and look, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. Instead, I took a deep breath and pushed the bike around the curve. As I rounded it, the dim glow of the streetlight started to bleed through the fog ahead. I moved faster, practically jogging now, until I was directly under it. I stopped there and finally turned around. There was nothing, just the thick curtain of white I'd come through. No sound, no movement. But I didn't feel relieved. I stood there for maybe a minute, scanning the fog. Then, without thinking too much, I lifted my bike, swung one leg over it, and pedaled fast toward home. I'd gone maybe another quarter-mile when I heard footsteps again, but this time they were behind me. They were matching my pace almost exactly, staying just far enough back that I couldn't see who it was through the fog. Every time I slowed down or sped up, the footsteps would adjust to match my rhythm after a few seconds. I kept glancing back but couldn't make out any shapes in the thick fog. My heart started beating faster because this definitely wasn't normal behavior for someone just walking home. The logical part of my brain said maybe it was someone who was also nervous about the fog and was using my footsteps as a guide, but something felt deliberately predatory about the way they were staying hidden. There was no reason for someone to be that quiet unless they wanted to stay unnoticed. I tried to ignore it, focused on the gravel crunching under my tires and the way the fog swirled in the glow from the occasional street lamp. But every so often, I'd hear it, just a half step behind, barely delayed, like they were mimicking me. At one point, I veered off the road a little, then quickly swerved back. A few seconds later, I heard the same slight deviation from behind me. It confirmed what I already knew. This person wasn't lost, and they weren't looking for directions. They were following me. I gripped the handlebars tighter and picked up speed, not quite sprinting but moving with urgency. I passed a mailbox I recognized, a faded red one with chipped paint. I knew I had less than a mile to go, but that last stretch was all woods on both sides. No houses until the street looped back toward town. I didn't want to be stuck in that section with someone trailing me. So I decided to test whether this person was actually following me by stopping completely and pretending to check my phone. The footsteps behind me stopped too, right when they should have kept going if someone was just walking their own route. That's when I knew for sure that whoever was back there was deliberately tracking my movements. Before I could turn around to confront them, I felt a hand grab my shoulder hard. I jerked away instinctively and jumped on my bike, pedaling as fast as I could through the fog without caring about visibility or safety. I could hear someone running behind me for the first few seconds, heavy footfalls pounding the asphalt, but then the sounds faded as I put distance between us. I didn't look back. The only thing that mattered was moving forward. I tore through the fog, wind in my face, tires slipping slightly on the damp road. At one point I hit a pothole and nearly lost control, but managed to stay upright. My legs were burning, lungs tight from the cold air, but I kept pedaling hard until I saw the soft orange glow of the gas station sign near my neighborhood. I didn't slow down until I reached the main road. The fog was thinner here, the lights brighter, and a car drove past in the opposite direction. That alone made me feel safer. I coasted the last few blocks, looking over my shoulder every few seconds, just to make sure nobody had followed me. I finally turned onto my street, pulled into my driveway, and slammed the bike down in the yard. My hands were shaking too much to unlock the front door on the first try. I got inside and locked it behind me, then went straight to the kitchen sink to throw up. I didn't sleep that night. I kept going over everything in my head, trying to figure out if I'd imagined the hand, the footsteps, the voice I thought I might have heard whisper my name before I pulled away. But it all felt too real. The next morning I called the police to report what happened, and they sent an officer out to check the area where I'd been grabbed. I gave them the street names and the stretch of road near the barns. They took it seriously. The officer didn't say much at first, just nodded and wrote things down. Later that afternoon, they called me back. They'd found scuff marks on the road shoulder that looked like signs of a struggle, and about 50 feet away in the grass they discovered a folding knife that had probably been dropped during my escape. A few days later, they arrested a homeless man who'd been camping in the woods near that road. He had a record: petty theft, assault, trespassing. He'd been robbing people walking alone at night. Mostly tourists and kids from town who took that back road thinking it was faster or safer. The officer told me the fog had been perfect cover for him because victims couldn't see him coming and couldn't identify him afterward. He didn't talk much when they picked him up, just muttered about how he thought I was someone else. I didn't ask for details. I got lucky that night. I was young and fast enough to get away, and that I'd brought my bike instead of walking the whole way. Sometimes I think about what would have happened if I hadn't looked over my shoulder, if I just kept walking. I still have the bike. The back reflector's cracked, and one handlebar's scratched from where I dropped it, but I never got it fixed. It's a reminder. Now I never walk alone on isolated roads at night, fog or no fog, because I learned how quickly a normal evening can turn dangerous when someone decides to make you their target. When I was 8, I stayed at my Uncle Robert's house every other weekend while my parents worked double shifts at the factory. His place was a single-story ranch on the outskirts of town, with a wide front yard and cracked pavement. You had to walk through the living room, past the kitchen, and down this narrow hallway to reach the bedrooms. Mine was all the way at the end, right next to this huge built-in storage closet. The thing stretched nearly the entire length of the wall and had sliding wooden doors that always stuck halfway. Inside, it smelled like old wood and mothballs, and was packed with cardboard boxes, holiday decorations, and random junk Uncle Robert never got around to tossing. I never liked opening it. The air in there always felt colder, and the overhead bulb was so dim it barely lit past the first row of shelves. But I didn't think much about it then. The first few weekends were nothing special. I brought my Game Boy and played for hours, sprawled out on the carpet with a box of dry cereal next to me. Uncle Robert mostly watched TV or tinkered with his truck out front. He was quiet, but decent. Every night he'd knock once on my door and say, "Don't stay up too late," and that was it. The bed creaked every time I rolled over, and the house had its usual night sounds: pipes knocking, fridge humming, wind in the gutters. But by the second weekend, I started noticing something strange. It began with this soft creaking coming from the closet. Not loud, just slow and steady, like someone shifting their weight on wooden boards. I figured it was the house settling, or maybe a mouse in the walls. Still, I pulled the covers higher and turned up the volume on my game. But it didn't stop. Every night around the same time, just after 1 or 2 in the morning, I'd hear it. A dragging sound, a slow creak, and sometimes a thud, like something shifting inside the closet. I told myself it was just the old stuff shifting in there, maybe the air causing the boxes to settle. But the noise didn't sound random. It sounded deliberate, like someone moving slowly and carefully. I stayed in bed with my back to the closet, trying not to breathe too loud. By the third weekend, I was dreading going over. I didn't tell my parents. They needed to work, and I didn't want to make a big deal out of something that was probably nothing. But the night I got there, I walked past the closet and felt this strange coldness along the wall. The hallway was warm from the central heating, but right near the closet it always felt cooler, like a window was cracked open. Uncle Robert had the thermostat set high, so it didn't make sense. That third night, I woke up just after 2. Not to the usual creaks, but a rustling sound. Fabric shifting. I stayed still, staring at the ceiling, hoping it would stop. It didn't. It went on. Soft, careful movement, like someone adjusting themselves inside a tight space. My heart was pounding so loud I could hear it in my ears. I slid out of bed without making a sound and padded across the hallway. Uncle Robert's door was cracked open. I knocked once, then pushed it open and whispered, "Uncle Robert." He didn't answer, so I walked up and gently shook his arm. "There's someone in the closet," I said. My voice was barely above a whisper. He groaned and rolled over. "You're dreaming again, kiddo. Go back to sleep." "I heard it," I said. "It's not a dream." He rubbed his eyes and sat up, annoyed but still half asleep. "All right, I'll check in the morning. Probably just mice or something." But in the morning, he did open the closet. He pulled the doors aside and stepped in, pushing boxes around with his foot. He lifted an old blanket off a pile of wreaths and motioned for me to come look. "See? Nothing here," he said. "You're letting your imagination run wild." I didn't say anything. I just stood there, staring at the back of the closet. There was a dent in the dust on the shelf, like something had been there recently, and the blanket he lifted looked freshly moved. That night he bought me a nightlight from the hardware store. "So, you're not scared of the dark anymore," he said, plugging it into the wall socket next to the door. It cast a soft orange glow across the room, just enough to make out the shape of the closet door from bed. I laid there under the covers, eyes wide open, waiting. Around 2 in the morning, the sound started again. A soft shifting, fabric brushing against cardboard, a faint scrape like fingernails brushing against wood. I didn't move. I didn't call for Uncle Robert again. I just stared at the closet, watching the slight shadows flicker along the edge where the door didn't quite close all the way. The noise went on for hours, small movements, one after another. Not loud, just enough to remind me that something, or someone, was definitely in there. I pulled the blanket up over my head and stayed still until the first light of dawn crept in through the window. 2 weeks later, I was back for another weekend visit, and the sounds were getting bolder. It wasn't just shifting boxes or quiet rustling anymore. I could hear what sounded like plastic lids popping, soft clinks like silverware, and the quiet scrape of something being dragged across a shelf. It was always around 2 in the morning, always just quiet enough to make me second-guess it by morning. During the day, things started feeling off, little details that didn't sit right. The cereal box I left on the kitchen table was suddenly back in the pantry. The bathroom door was slightly ajar when I was sure I'd left it closed. A coffee mug with dried foam in the sink, even though neither of us drank coffee that morning. I mentioned it to Uncle Robert during dinner, but he just shrugged and said, "Must be me getting forgetful." Then he laughed, but it didn't sound normal. More like he wanted to laugh and move on quickly. I couldn't tell if he was actually forgetting things or pretending to. That Saturday night, I was reading under the blanket with the nightlight on when I heard footsteps in the hallway. They were slow and heavy, not like Uncle Robert's normal shuffle. More like someone who didn't want to be heard but wasn't careful enough. They stopped right outside my door. I froze. The shadow under the door stayed still for several seconds, not moving, not even swaying. Then it continued down the hallway toward the kitchen. I didn't check. I couldn't. I stayed completely still, holding my breath, until the nightlight faded and morning came. When I finally stepped into the kitchen the next day, I noticed right away, the fridge looked different. Leftovers were missing. A whole Tupperware container of chicken and a slice of pie I had planned on eating. I checked the trash. The container wasn't there. The utensils drawer was slightly open, and the butter knife I used for toast was gone. On Sunday night, I couldn't take it anymore. I didn't tell Uncle Robert. I just acted normal, waited for him to go to bed, then got the aluminum baseball bat from the garage and brought it into my room. I sat by the door, waiting. The nightlight cast faint shadows across the carpet. Around 1 a.m. I heard it. The closet door opening, followed by slow steps. The same deliberate pace as before. The hallway creaked with each step. I gripped the bat tighter, barely breathing, and opened my door just a crack. The steps reached the kitchen, then paused. I slipped into the hallway, bare feet silent against the floor. The house was dark, except for the faint glow of the stove clock. I moved closer, one step at a time. When I reached the kitchen entrance, I saw him. A thin man, maybe in his 30s or 40s, with long greasy hair and a filthy t-shirt, was crouched by the fridge, eating peanut butter with his fingers. He was barefoot, his pants stained and torn. He had an empty look in his eyes, like he wasn't all there. I flipped the light switch. The room lit up instantly. He spun around, eyes wild and bloodshot, peanut butter smeared across his mouth and chin. We locked eyes. For a second, neither of us moved. Then I screamed, loud, as loud as I could. He dropped the jar and ran, pushing past me, feet slapping against the hallway floor. I chased him for a second but stopped when he slammed the back door open and vanished into the night. Uncle Robert came running in, wearing only his pajama bottoms. "What happened?" he asked, trying to catch his breath. "There was someone in the house," I said. "He was in the kitchen. He came from the closet." We called the police right away. They showed up about 15 minutes later, checked the perimeter, and then began searching the closet. It wasn't hard to see where he'd been. Behind the boxes, in the far back corner, there was a makeshift bed made out of old cushions, a pile of food wrappers, and a flashlight. One of Uncle Robert's shaving razors was there too, along with 2 of my socks and a bunch of small things. Spare change, a phone charger, even one of Robert's watches. The cops found signs that the man had been living there for a while, probably at least a month. They said he must have waited until we were asleep each night to sneak out and eat, sometimes rummaging through our stuff, sometimes just watching. The idea made my skin crawl, watching us, through those closet slats, every time I walked by, every time I slept with my back to the wall. His name was Marcus Webb. One of the officers recognized him from past incidents. Local addict. Had broken into a few houses in the area, sometimes just to steal, other times looking for a place to stay. He had a history of hiding out in garages and crawl spaces, but this time he'd taken it further. They said he probably watched us for a while before choosing Uncle Robert's house. Knew when we were asleep, when the hallway was dark. Used the kitchen when he wanted. Stole only what he thought wouldn't be noticed right away. They caught him 2 days later trying to break into a house just 3 blocks away. Same thing, waiting for the lights to go off, then picking the lock. But this time the homeowner was awake, and he didn't get far. Uncle Robert installed a security system the same week. New locks, motion lights, and cameras. But after that, I only stayed over once more. Just one time. I couldn't relax. Every sound made me jump. I kept staring at the closet, wondering what it felt like for him, crouched in there, listening to me breathe. I never went back again. Now I sleep with my closet door shut and locked. I check every night. Even if it's empty, I double check. Sometimes I wonder how many houses have someone living in their walls, waiting for the right moment to come out. Not for money, not for revenge, just because they can. So this happened back when I was 23, living in a small rental apartment in Portland during that whole creepy clown craze that was all over social media. I worked late shifts at a call center, so I was usually getting home around 10 p.m. when the neighborhood was already settling down for the night. My building was older, with thin walls and a shared backyard that connected to an alley where people sometimes dumped trash. I had been hearing weird metal scraping sounds against the fence for a few days, but my neighbor mentioned they were fixing their gate, so I figured that explained it. The whole clown thing online seemed stupid to me, just attention-seeking idiots trying to go viral by scaring people. I never thought it would actually affect me personally. That Thursday evening changed everything. It started normal. I got home, threw my backpack on the floor, kicked off my shoes, and microwaved some leftover Chinese food. I remember it was orange chicken and lo mein, and I stood there in the kitchen scrolling through my phone while waiting for it to heat up. The back window over the sink faced the alley and the shared yard, but I never paid it much attention except to check if the recycling guys had come. That night, though, while the microwave spun behind me, I saw something shift outside. It was just movement at first, like someone stepping into view. I figured it was maybe the guy from downstairs bringing out garbage. But when I looked directly out the window, I froze. Someone was standing there, almost perfectly still, facing my apartment. Full clown costume. Bright red nose, thick white face paint, raggedy wig. The costume looked cheap, like something from a dollar store, but the knife in his hand caught the porch light just right. That wasn't a prop. He was holding it up to his chest with one hand and pointing at my kitchen window with the other, like he wanted me to know he saw me watching. My heart started pounding. At first, I thought it was some dumb prank, but then he started walking toward the front door. Not running, just slow, exaggerated steps like he was doing a performance. But for who? I didn't think. I stepped back from the window, turned off the kitchen light, and walked fast but quiet to the door. Locked the handle, slid the chain, turned the deadbolt. I stood there a second with my phone in my hand. I didn't call anyone. I just waited, thinking maybe he'd knock and move on. But he didn't knock. He started hitting the door with his fists. Not hard enough to break it, but loud. Like he wanted to be heard all through the building. Between hits, he kept saying the same thing in this high fake voice, like a cartoon character. Come out and play. Come out and play. I backed up and went to the side window near the couch to see if I could get a better look. He was standing directly under the porch light now, waving the knife in slow circles in front of him, still looking straight at my apartment. I took a quick video on my phone, but the screen shook so much it was probably useless. I didn't post it anywhere. I didn't even think about that. All I could think was whether he was going to try and break in. I didn't have a weapon. I had a heavy flashlight in a drawer, but that was it. No bat, no nothing. After a minute or so, the banging stopped. I peeked through the blinds again. He wasn't there anymore. I waited. Nothing. I listened hard for footsteps or the fence squeaking again, but it was silent. I sat down on the edge of the couch, still holding my phone, my thumb hovering over 9-1-1. Then something thudded against the window behind me. Not glass breaking, just a heavy thud like someone hitting it with their palm. I jumped up, turned, and caught a flash of white and red retreating into the shadows. He'd gone around to the side of the building. Now I called the cops, told them there was a guy in a clown outfit trying to break into my apartment. The dispatcher didn't sound surprised, said they'd send someone. I sat there waiting with all the lights off, flashlight in one hand, phone in the other, every muscle in my body tight. I kept checking the window but didn't see him again. 15 minutes later, 2 officers knocked. I let them in. They did a quick sweep around the property, but of course by then he was gone. They asked if he tried to get inside. I said no, but he was banging and waving a knife. They asked if I recognized him. I didn't. One of them said they'd had a few similar reports lately, but it was usually teens with rubber knives. They took my statement and left. I didn't sleep that night. The next day I told my landlord, who didn't seem to care much beyond saying he'd check the security lights in the alley. I installed a camera by the door the same day. I didn't tell anyone at work what happened. I just kept playing it over in my head, trying to figure out why he picked my place. I didn't have any enemies. Nobody knew my schedule. It felt random, but also not. Like he was waiting, watching. That was the last time I saw him. But for weeks afterward, I kept hearing that same slow metal scraping on the back fence late at night. Always around 10:30. I never opened the window to look. I dialed 911 while he kept banging and shouting outside, telling the dispatcher that someone in a clown mask was threatening me with a weapon. The operator stayed on the line and said officers were on their way, but I lived in a quieter part of town where response times could be slow. I kept checking the windows while holding the phone to my ear. He had moved to the side of the building now and was trying the window latches. I watched as he pressed his painted face against the glass, grinning wide like it was a joke. I could hear him saying things, not to me, but to someone else. "Are you getting this?" And, "This is perfect footage." It took me a second to process what that meant. He was being filmed. This was some kind of recording, but I was too scared to care about his motives. I crouched behind the couch and reached into the drawer where I kept a kitchen knife. I gripped the handle hard and stayed low, heart racing so fast I thought I might pass out. I could see both the front door and the living room window from where I sat. He was still out there, pacing back and forth, tapping the knife against the window. The dispatcher kept talking to me, trying to keep me calm, asking if I had a weapon, if I could lock myself in a room. I didn't want to move. I didn't want to take my eyes off the window. Then I heard something I didn't expect. Gravel crunching under tires. David's truck pulling into the driveway. He was supposed to come over after his shift at the warehouse. He parked like normal, not realizing what was going on until he stepped out and saw the clown standing near the side fence. I heard him yell, "Hey! What the hell are you doing?" The clown spun around and bolted, sprinting toward the backyard. David chased him around the building, shouting, and I stayed low, still holding the knife, not sure if I should run out or stay put. There was a crash, glass shattering. I peeked through the back window and saw the clown had slammed into my neighbor's garden window trying to jump the fence. That's when I noticed movement just behind the fence. Someone else was there. A guy in a black hoodie holding a DSLR camera, ducked low like he thought no one would notice. He was filming the whole thing. It wasn't just some lunatic clown. It was a setup. A video. David didn't hesitate. He tackled the clown in the alley behind the building and pinned him to the ground, yelling at him to stop squirming. I ran outside then, knife still in my hand, shaking so bad I almost dropped it. Within minutes, 2 police cruisers pulled up with their lights flashing. Officers ran in shouting commands. One of them dragged the camera guy out from behind the fence while another pulled David off the guy in the clown suit. They searched the bag the cameraman had with him. Inside were plastic weapons, a few masks, some prop blood, and extra batteries. The knife the clown had been using turned out to be rubber, but from inside my apartment, under porch lighting, it looked real enough to make my blood freeze. The guy in the makeup was probably 20 or 21. His face was soaked in sweat, paint running down into his neck collar, and he kept talking fast, like he was trying to explain. "It's just a prank. It's a prank for YouTube, man. We're not trying to hurt anyone." The officers didn't care. They cuffed both of them. The one filming tried to run once, but he didn't get far before they tackled him on the sidewalk. I gave my statement while still trembling. One of the officers helped me sit down on the porch steps, while another radioed in the charges. Harassment, trespassing, destruction of property. My neighbor came out too, angry about the shattered window, glass all over his petunias. The cops asked if I wanted to press charges. I didn't hesitate. I found out later their channel had almost 200,000 subscribers. Dozens of videos just like what happened to me. Them scaring random women at night. One where they followed someone down a parking garage in a pig mask. Another where they pretended to be burglars. They thought it was hilarious. All of it designed to go viral. Turns out, I wasn't their first victim. Just the first one where the police were called in time. I pressed charges and also filed a civil suit for emotional distress. The neighbor did the same for the broken window. The court gave them probation and community service, and the judge ordered them to pay restitution. Their YouTube channel was deleted within the week. Instagram, TikTok, all of it shut down for violating terms of service. The judge made it clear they were lucky no one got hurt. If David had shown up with a gun instead of bare hands, things could have gone a lot worse. After that, I couldn't sleep right for a long time. Every knock on the door made my chest seize up. I moved to a different place 3 weeks later. Top floor, controlled access building, motion lights on every walkway. Installed my own cameras too, just in case. I never wanted to live like that, always checking corners, always watching shadows. But once you see someone treating your fear like entertainment, it changes something in you. People need to understand that this stuff isn't funny. It's not content. It's trauma. And if someone had fought back, pulled a real knife or a gun, it wouldn't be a prank anymore. It would be a crime scene. It's all fun and games until somebody doesn't know it's fake. When I was 29, working at a marketing firm downtown, I had this ongoing obsession with upgrading my entertaining setup for when friends came over. I kept seeing these beautiful wooden charcuterie boards on Pinterest and Instagram, the kind that made cheese and crackers look like art gallery displays. The good ones were expensive, like $60 to $80, so I kept putting off the purchase even though I really wanted one. I never mentioned this desire to anyone. Not my roommate Sarah, not my coworkers, not even my mom during our weekly phone calls. It was just this private little wish list item that I would think about sometimes when I was planning dinner parties in my head. I had even bookmarked a few specific designs from different Etsy shops, but never actually clicked buy. The whole thing felt too indulgent for something I would only use occasionally. Most nights I'd come home, microwave a Trader Joe's meal, maybe pour a glass of wine, and sit on the couch scrolling through my phone. One of those nights, I scrolled through a feed that was all ads for serving boards and cheese knives, probably from all the Pinterest searching I'd done. I kept staring at this one design that had clean edges and deep walnut grain, and I remember thinking, maybe next paycheck. I put the phone down and forgot about it. A few days later, I was waiting for the elevator in the lobby after work when I noticed the mailman dropping off packages by the apartment entryway. It wasn't unusual, but one of them had my name on it. Just a standard brown box, taped up, no gift wrapping. I picked it up and double-checked the label. My name, my address, but no return name, just a fulfillment center in Ohio. I walked up to the apartment, still assuming it was maybe something I'd ordered a while back and forgotten about. It wouldn't have been the first time. I carried it into the kitchen and opened it with a steak knife. Inside was exactly the kind of charcuterie board I'd wanted. Dark walnut wood, elegant brass handles, and even a matching cheese knife set nestled in a small velvet-lined box. It was heavy, solid, expensive looking. The craftsmanship was better than anything I'd even saved online. I stood there holding it, trying to make sense of it. I checked the shipping label again. Still just my name, address, and the Ohio Return Center. No card, no invoice, no from anything. I even checked inside the box, underneath the foam lining, but there was nothing else. Just the board, the knives, and the packaging. Sarah came home a little while later. I held it up to show her as soon as she walked in the door. She looked confused and said, "Whoa, that's really nice. Did you buy that?" I shook my head. It just showed up today. No sender. No card. She took the box and checked it herself, then gave me a weird look. "You seriously don't know who sent it?" "Nope." "Maybe your mom?" "She doesn't even know I wanted one." That night, I left it on the kitchen island, still not sure what to do with it. I kept checking my email and Amazon account, thinking maybe it was some weird delayed shipment, but I hadn't bought anything like that, and it wasn't from Amazon. The next morning, I called the fulfillment center in Ohio listed on the return address, but the woman who answered said they just pack and ship things. They wouldn't know who placed the order unless I had an order number. Over the next few days, I brought it up to a few people. My sister, a co-worker I was close with, but no one claimed it. Everyone joked that I had a secret admirer, or that someone must be trying to butter me up. I laughed along, but something about it didn't sit right with me. It wasn't the kind of thing anyone would send on a whim. It was too specific. Too perfectly matched to something I'd never told anyone about. I kept it in the kitchen, right on the counter, where I could see it when I walked in from work. For the first week, I didn't use it. Just stared at it, like it was waiting for me to figure something out. On Saturday, I finally used it. I had a couple friends over for wine and snacks, and I laid out crackers, grapes, and cheese on the board. It looked as good as the Pinterest photos, maybe better. Everyone commented on how beautiful it was. Sarah even said, "Okay, who do I have to date to get one of these?" I laughed, but the whole time I was thinking about how nobody was supposed to know I wanted it. That night after they left, I cleaned it and put it back on the counter. The next morning, I noticed something that hadn't been there before. A faint scratch along the brass handle on the left side. It wasn't from our use. It looked older, like a shallow scrape that had been there before. I didn't think much of it, except that I could have sworn it hadn't been there when I first unboxed it. The following week, I came home to find Sarah sitting at the table, looking at her phone. She asked if I had moved the board. "No," I said. "Why?" "It was on the dining table when I got home. I figured you were doing some kind of setup." I walked over. The board was sitting right in the middle of the table, perfectly centered. The cheese knife was beside it. We both just stood there, quiet. Neither of us said anything for a second. "I didn't move it," I said. "I definitely didn't touch it," she replied. I picked it up and carried it back to the counter. Neither of us talked about it again that night. But from that point on, I always made sure to leave it in the exact same spot when I left for work. And every day after that, I'd come home and double-check it was still there, just to be sure. I spent that evening going through every account I had. Email, Amazon, Etsy, PayPal, credit card history, everything. I filtered dates, searched keywords, scanned for charges I didn't recognize. Nothing. No transaction, no pending shipment, no confirmation email buried in the spam folder. It was like the board had simply materialized. I even tried to remember if I could have bought it while half asleep, or during one of those nights where I doom scroll myself into a weird mental fog, but there was no trace of it anywhere. I went through my phone photos, hoping I might have taken a screenshot of a listing or a cart page. There were a few images saved from months ago, but nothing that looked like the exact board that had arrived. I called my mom again, just to double-check. "Are you absolutely sure you didn't send me a charcuterie board?" I asked. "Sweetie, I don't even know what that is," she said. "Is it some kind of French cutting board?" Then I called my friend Julia, who was big on housewarming gifts. "Nope," she said, "though now I wish I had, because that sounds like a great idea." "Did it at least come with wine?" Only my coworker Lisa made a joke about it. "Maybe it's from your future stalker husband. You know, the kind who learns your favorite wine from your Instagram stories." I didn't laugh. I was starting to feel like someone had access to things they shouldn't. Someone who knew what I liked. Someone who had somehow learned this private little craving that I'd never voiced out loud. That night I moved the board into the pantry and shut the door. It felt wrong to leave it out like a normal object. I didn't want to look at it when I walked into the kitchen. The next day, I worked from home and kept checking the front door every hour. No packages came, but I still opened the blinds and double-checked the deadbolt. Nothing happened. But around 11:30 p.m., I noticed that the pantry door was open. Just slightly. I hadn't gone in there since the morning. I shut it again. I didn't say anything to Sarah. She already thought I was being dramatic. The following morning, I sat down with my laptop and tried tracking the original shipment again. I looked up the shipping number on the label and traced it back to a logistics company that handled deliveries for hundreds of online retailers. I called the number on their site and was on hold for 32 minutes before someone answered. The man on the phone said their system couldn't provide order details without a tracking code or buyer ID, and since I wasn't the one who placed the order, there was nothing they could tell me. I thanked him and hung up. Then I looked up the manufacturer of the board. Stamped lightly into the wood was the name Cressmont Living. Their website was sleek, full of minimalist kitchenware, and most of their boards sold for $120 or more. I clicked through the product listings until I found one that matched mine exactly. It was called the Walnut Hostess Elite. It came in one finish. It had brass handles. It came with the same cheese knife set. I called their customer service line next. The woman who answered sounded cheerful until I asked whether they could trace a delivery without an order number. She said their system didn't allow it for privacy reasons. "I understand," I said. "But could there have been a promotion recently? Like a giveaway?" "No," she said. "Nothing like that. Sorry." I hung up and sat back in my chair. I had no more leads. No more theories that made sense. Either it was a one-time fluke, a warehouse mistake, or someone, somewhere, was watching me very closely. That night, I opened the pantry and looked at the board. I pulled it out and placed it back on the counter. Then I turned all the lights off and stood in the kitchen watching it. I stayed there for 15 minutes. Nothing happened. In the days that followed, I used the board once or twice for small things, cheese and crackers when I worked late, olives and nuts while I watched a movie. I hated that I liked it so much. I hated how perfect it was. It didn't feel like a gift. It felt like bait. Then, nearly a month later, a second package showed up. It was smaller, lighter. Same label format. My name, my address, no sender. When I opened it, there was a box inside wrapped in tissue paper. Inside that, 4 wine glasses. Thin-stemmed, modern shape, rimmed with gold. They matched the brass on the board exactly. I stood in the kitchen holding the glass up to the light. It was beautiful. I checked the box for any paperwork. Nothing. I checked the bottom for a brand. There was none. I called Sarah into the kitchen. "Is this some kind of joke?" I asked her. She looked at the glasses, then back at me. "Okay, this is weird now. I think someone's watching my browser, or listening through my phone. You should call someone. Like, report it." "To who?" I said. "There's no crime." That night I changed every password I had. Google, banking, Netflix, Wi-Fi, all of it. I turned off microphone access on every app. I deleted 3 shopping extensions from my browser I didn't even remember installing. I started using a VPN. I didn't tell Sarah everything. I didn't tell her how many times I had searched for those exact glasses before. Or that I had saved a set in a shopping cart just a week earlier. I still don't know where the packages came from. I never got another. The wine glasses stayed on the top shelf, and the board lived in a drawer after that. I only bring them out when friends come over now. They always say the same thing. "This is so nice. Where'd you get it?" And I always say, "It was a gift." And I leave it at that. But every time I pour a drink or slice cheese across that dark walnut surface, I wonder what else they know I want. I wonder what they're waiting to send next. So my husband Mark works as a nurse at the county hospital, and during his rotation on the ICU night shift, I was home alone for 12-hour stretches from 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. Our house was in a decent neighborhood, but the front door faced a poorly lit street where people sometimes parked to walk to the nearby bars. I had gotten into a routine of cleaning and organizing while listening to talk radio programs to keep myself company during those long evenings. We had 2 dogs, Bella, our older German Shepherd mix, and Scout, a young border collie who was usually hyperactive and playful. That particular Tuesday night started normally, with me folding laundry in the living room while some radio show discussed conspiracy theories about the government. I was only half listening until I noticed both dogs had suddenly stopped playing and were staring intensely at our front door. Bella's behavior was especially unusual because she was typically very social and would normally bark at any sign of visitors or strange noises. Instead, she was completely silent, but visibly tense, her ears pinned back and her body rigid with alert attention. Scout had dropped his tennis ball and moved to stand beside her, both of them focused on something I couldn't hear or see. I muted the radio and listened carefully, trying to figure out what had caught their attention. That's when I heard it. Heavy, labored breathing coming from right outside our front door. It sounded like someone who was extremely intoxicated or possibly having some kind of medical episode. The breathing was irregular and raspy, with long pauses between each inhale and exhale. My first thought was that maybe someone was having a heart attack or overdose on our porch and needed help. I stood up slowly, walked over to the door, and looked through the peephole. I couldn't see anyone. The small lens was fogged slightly from the humidity, but even wiping it didn't help. The porch light was on, but it didn't reach far beyond the steps. I thought maybe someone had collapsed just out of view. The breathing kept going. This wet, wheezing sound that seemed to drift a little, like the person was swaying or shifting position. I hesitated, then moved to the front window where the blinds were shut tight. I tilted one slat down just a little, enough to peek outside. I could see part of the porch, the edge of the steps, the sidewalk, but again, no one. I waited, frozen, thinking maybe I'd catch a glimpse of someone moving. Nothing. But the sound was still there. I debated opening the door. Part of me wanted to help if someone was really in trouble. But both dogs were acting strange now. Bella wouldn't move from her spot. Scout was pacing in small circles, ears perked. I stepped back and picked up my phone from the coffee table. I called the non-emergency number for the police and explained the situation. They said they'd send a patrol car by in a few minutes. I didn't hang up, just lowered the phone and kept listening. The breathing sound had changed slightly. It was closer, much closer, like it was just inches from the door now. Then it stopped. There was a knock. Not loud, not frantic. Just 3 slow knocks. Then silence. I stood in the middle of the living room, phone still pressed to my ear, and waited. Another knock. Same rhythm. Bella growled low in her throat, just once. It was the first sound either of them had made in almost 10 minutes. I backed away from the door and said quietly into the phone, "They're knocking now." The dispatcher said the patrol car was 5 minutes away. I told her I wasn't going to open the door, and she told me to stay on the line and not to approach it. Then the doorknob moved. It didn't jiggle or rattle. It turned, slowly, deliberately, and then stopped. I could hear the faint creak of the springs inside the mechanism as it twisted. We had a deadbolt, thankfully, and it was locked, but whoever was out there knew exactly where to reach. I crouched down behind the couch, keeping an eye on the door. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely hear the dispatcher anymore. Scout was now whining softly, and Bella's eyes never left the door. A minute passed, then another. No more knocks, no more breathing. Then the doorknob turned again, harder this time, like they were testing it. And then it stopped. A few seconds later, I heard footsteps, not walking away, moving to the side, like they were circling the house. I told the dispatcher, and she said the officer was almost there. I ran to the back of the house, checked the windows, made sure everything was locked. When I got back to the front, I could hear something brushing up against the siding. A faint scraping. Then the sound of a shoe scuffing the concrete. A car pulled up. I saw the headlights sweep across the side window, and I rushed to the door, yelling to the dispatcher that the police were here. I unlocked the door and opened it a few inches. The officer was already out of the car and walking up the driveway. I waved to him and opened the door wider. The front yard was empty. The officer scanned the area with his flashlight, walking around the porch, shining it toward the bushes and sidewalk. Nothing. He asked me to describe what I'd heard and seen. I gave him everything I could. He walked the perimeter, checked the backyard, but didn't find anyone. No footprints, no signs of someone standing in the dirt by the window. He said it might have been a drunk person who wandered off, but even he didn't sound convinced. He told me to keep the doors locked and to call again if anything else happened. Then he got back in the car and drove away. I shut the door and locked everything again. The dogs still weren't settled. Bella sat at the base of the stairs, staring at the front door. Scout was under the coffee table, not moving. I sat back down, phone still in my hand, and listened. I grabbed Mark's baseball bat from the bedroom closet and quietly locked both dogs in the back bedroom so they wouldn't interfere if I needed to call for medical assistance. Moving carefully to avoid making any noise, I approached the front door and looked through the peephole. What I saw made my stomach drop. There was a person's eye pressed right against the outside of the peephole, staring directly back at me. The eye was bloodshot and unfocused, surrounded by pale, sweaty skin that looked unhealthy. The breathing immediately became faster and more agitated, as if the person realized they were being watched. I stepped back from the door as quietly as possible, but then the doorknob started rattling violently. Someone was trying to turn the handle and push their way into my house, grunting with effort and muttering incoherent words under their breath. The sound of the handle rattling was fast and clumsy, like they were shaking it in frustration. I stood frozen, gripping the bat, trying to breathe quietly. Then came the thud, the first hit against the door. It wasn't full force, but it was enough to make the frame creak. The mumbling got louder, sharper, almost angry now. I could hear the words clearer, phrases like, "Open the door," and "I saw you." The voice was hoarse and unsteady. I backed away slowly, holding the bat tight with both hands, and slipped into the hallway near the kitchen. I crouched near the corner wall, waiting to see if the next sound would be glass breaking or wood splintering. Another slam hit the door, harder this time. I knew it wouldn't hold if he kept that up. Panic set in as I realized this wasn't a medical emergency, but someone actively trying to break into my home while I was alone and vulnerable. The person was jiggling the doorknob more aggressively now, occasionally slamming their shoulder against the doorframe. I could hear them mumbling something that sounded like, "I know you're in there," mixed with other slurred phrases I couldn't make out. My hands were shaking as I considered calling 911, but I was afraid that talking on the phone might make them more violent or determined to get inside. That's when I remembered the radio and came up with a desperate plan. I ran back to the living room and turned the volume all the way up, hoping that a male voice from the talk show would make it sound like my husband was home. The radio host was discussing politics in a deep, authoritative voice that echoed throughout the house. I crouched low behind the armchair and listened, every muscle tensed. The man outside stopped banging the door. He didn't say anything. I couldn't even hear him breathing anymore. For a few seconds, the only sound was the voice on the radio echoing through the living room. I stayed completely still, hoping the illusion would work. Then I heard it. Shuffling footsteps moving away from the porch. Slow and dragging, like someone who didn't want to draw attention but wasn't in a hurry. I waited a minute before creeping to the window again. I used just one finger to slide a single slat of the blinds open. The porch was empty. The sidewalk too. I couldn't see anyone, but I didn't trust it. The strategy worked better than I had hoped. Within 30 seconds, the rattling and mumbling stopped completely. When I crept back to check the peephole, no one was there, and the heavy breathing had disappeared. I kept the radio loud for another hour, periodically checking to make sure the person hadn't returned or moved to try the back door. When Mark came home at 7:30 a.m., I told him what happened, and he immediately called our neighbor Mrs. Patterson to ask if she had seen anything unusual. She said the sound of the radio had woken her up around midnight, but she had also noticed that the main entrance door to our apartment building had been left propped open, even though the property manager always secured it before 9 p.m. We reported the incident to the police and building management, but without security cameras or more specific details, there wasn't much they could do. I learned that sometimes the most effective defense is making potential intruders believe you're not as vulnerable as you actually are. I started researching my family genealogy last year after my grandmother passed away. She used to mention that we had Irish ancestors who came over during the potato famine, but she never gave any names or solid dates. I think she only remembered what her parents told her, and those were probably stories passed down without much detail. So after the funeral, I decided to look into it for real. I signed up for one of those ancestry sites and started pulling records from whatever I could find. Church entries, census data, immigration manifests, even grave records. After a couple of months of digging, I found a match that lined up. Our family had settled in rural Iowa in the 1850s. That part of Iowa still looks pretty empty on Google Maps today. Back then, it was mostly farmland and rough wooden houses spread out over miles. One of the first things I noticed in the records was how tight-knit they were. The family seemed to revolve around the local parish, and there were a bunch of baptism and marriage entries all tied to the same church. Very Catholic, very traditional. One note I found in a priest's personal ledger mentioned that the family believed the veil between the living and dead thinned around All Saints' Day, November 1st. That caught my attention. Apparently, they held private masses at home during that time, believing that the dead could hear their prayers more clearly. It struck me as strange, but I figured that was just old country superstition carried over. But then things got weird. In the fall of 1863, one of the daughters in the family, my great-great-grandmother, got sick. Her name was Nora. She was 22, recently married, and, from what I gathered, already dealing with one miscarriage. The journal entry from her sister-in-law said she came down with a sudden fever. It started in late October. By November 1st, she was unresponsive. They described her as gone cold and pale, her lips dark as ash, and her chest still as if the breath had gone. There were no doctors anywhere nearby back then. People handled death on their own. They held a home wake for her that same day. The women washed her, dressed her in white, and set her in the parlor with a crucifix in her hands. By evening, the men had dug a grave in the family plot behind the house, under an old cedar tree. She was buried with a rosary around her neck and two of her dogs sitting nearby. Her husband tried to call them away before the soil was filled in, but the animals refused to move. The younger dog even growled when someone got too close. Eventually, they left them there and finished the burial. I almost stopped reading at that point. The handwriting was shaky and hard to follow, but something about the way they described the dogs stuck with me. A few more entries later, it got worse. The animals wouldn't leave the grave. They slept next to the mound every night, barely eating, and refused to follow anyone back inside. After 3 days, the older dog stopped barking altogether and just stared at the dirt like it was listening for something. The younger one scratched at the ground every morning until its paws were raw. That went on for over a week. The family thought the behavior was grief. One of Nora's cousins wrote that dogs sense the soul and stay near their masters even after death. But by day 7, both dogs had gone frantic. They barked until their throats were hoarse and clawed deep grooves into the soil. Her husband, my great-great-grandfather, tried tying them up in the barn to stop the noise. It didn't help. They whined and howled non-stop. He moved his bed out to the far shed just to get some sleep, but even then, he said he could still hear them scratching at the wood. One morning, the older dog bit through its rope and was found back at the grave, pawing at the base of the cedar tree. Its fur was covered in mud and blood from its feet. That was the first time someone said aloud that something was wrong. Her brother told the others, "It's not mourning anymore. They're trying to tell us something." But nobody wanted to say what that could mean. They'd already mourned her. She was buried. And disturbing a grave, especially on sacred ground, was considered a sin. Still, the younger dog refused to stop. Every hour, it returned to the same spot and dug with everything it had. Eventually, it uncovered part of the burial shroud, just the edge. One of the cousins saw it and ran inside without saying a word. They locked the dogs in the root cellar after that. My great-great-grandfather sat up through the night with a lantern by the back window, watching the plot. He didn't write anything down, but someone else did. His younger sister noted in her diary, "He does not pray. He only watches. There is fear in him." The final entry before the ink fades out is dated November 10th. It says the dogs would not stop howling and scratching from inside the cellar. The door rattled with their weight, and at some point during the night, the latch gave out. He went outside with a lantern, barefoot in the frost, and followed the sound. That was the last line written. The rest of the page is blank. Finally, my great-great-grandfather decided to investigate what was disturbing the animals so much. It had been over a week since the burial, and nobody had gotten any real sleep. The dogs were still howling day and night, their voices hoarse and broken, but relentless. On the morning of November 11th, after another night of scratching and barking, he walked out into the yard with a shovel and called for his 2 brothers and a cousin to meet him. No one argued. They were pale, red-eyed from lack of sleep, already worn down by the constant noise and the growing sense that something had gone terribly wrong. The grave was shallow by today's standards, only about 3 feet deep. The ground was soft and damp from the November frost. They worked in silence, just the sound of metal scraping soil and the occasional grunt. The dogs watched from a distance, ears forward, panting. When the shovel finally hit the top of the coffin, the youngest brother flinched like he'd been struck. They brushed away the remaining dirt with their hands, then pried the lid open with a crowbar. What they saw inside was worse than any nightmare. My great-great-grandmother had not died from her illness. She had died clawing at the inside of her own coffin. Her fingers were broken and bloodied, the nails splintered and torn. The lid above her was shredded with scratch marks, long dark grooves carved into the pine wood. Her face had twisted into something that didn't look human anymore. Mouth open wide, eyes bulged, her lips split and dried from screaming. Her shroud was soaked in sweat and blood. She'd woken up in the dark and suffocated in the silence, buried alive. The men stood there frozen for what felt like minutes. No one spoke. No one moved. My great-great-grandfather dropped the lantern. The glass shattered and the flames snuffed out in the wet soil. He fell to his knees, holding his head, rocking slightly. The others pulled the coffin fully from the ground and set it to the side, not knowing what to do next. One of them crossed himself, but none of them prayed aloud. They reburied her that afternoon in silence, this time deeper, sealed again in a new coffin built hastily from stronger wood. No words were said. The dogs didn't return to the gravesite. They had done their part, and their howling stopped the moment the coffin was opened. That night, for the first time in 10 days, the farm was quiet. The men who saw her that day were never the same. My great-great-grandfather didn't speak a word to anyone for the next 2 days. He didn't eat. He didn't sleep. On the 3rd morning, someone found him hanging in the barn, the same place they had locked the dogs after the scratching became too much. He had used a rope from the hay pulleys. There was no note. Just a chair tipped over, and his boots dangling above the dirt. The family broke apart after that. The 2 brothers moved east. The cousin, who had been keeping a journal, stopped writing entirely after the entry describing the coffin. Within 6 months, the farm was sold. The animals were given away. The house was left empty and eventually collapsed in on itself. By the time the next census came, there was no sign that our family had ever lived there. My grandmother never spoke about Iowa. When I asked as a kid where our family came from, she just said, "farmland," and left it at that. It wasn't until I started digging into the genealogy records that the truth started to surface. Even then, I didn't know what I was reading at first. The cousin's diary entries were buried in a courthouse basement, filed in a water-damaged folder behind land transfer documents and faded maps. If I hadn't looked close, I would have missed them entirely. Reading those pages made my skin crawl. The handwriting was shaky, like the writer's hand couldn't keep steady. The final entry simply said, "She was alive. We buried her alive." I couldn't sleep for days after that. I kept seeing that sentence every time I closed my eyes. I dreamed of the dogs barking, dirt hitting wood, nails scratching endlessly in the dark. I didn't tell anyone in my family what I found. Not my sister, not my parents. I scanned the documents, saved them to a hard drive, and locked them away. Some things don't need to be passed down. I understand now why my grandmother always changed the subject when people brought up ancestry. I used to think it was because she didn't know much, but she did. She just didn't want to remember. Still, I think about the dogs. They knew. They tried. In a way, they were the only ones who understood what was happening. And if someone had listened, really listened, things might have ended differently. It makes me look at animals differently now. We assume we're the smart ones. But maybe, sometimes, we're just the loudest. I stopped researching after that. I deleted my family tree online and canceled my subscription. I kept one scanned copy of the cousin's diary, tucked away in a folder with no name. I haven't opened it since. There are some truths that don't help anyone. Some stories are too heavy to carry forward. This is one of them. I moved in with my grandfather Wesley when I was 14, just after my parents' divorce. There wasn't much discussion about it. I was old enough to hear them yelling through walls, but too young for them to care what I thought. My mom packed a duffel, dropped me at Wesley's farm in rural Iowa, and that was that. The place was quiet, like oppressively so, with a house that creaked at night and cornfields that went on forever. Wesley wasn't the talkative type either. He'd nod a hello in the morning, make sure I was fed, and then go about his day. The farm had one other resident, Carlos. He'd already been living there when I arrived, in a little cottage down the gravel path past the shed. Wesley introduced him simply as the help. Carlos was responsible for most of the outdoor work, maintaining the cornfields, repairing fences, and especially the scarecrows. Those things were everywhere. Not just one or two, but at least a dozen, spaced out evenly in the field. Some were dressed in flannel, others in overalls. A few had hats. They all had burlap sack faces with painted eyes and stitched mouths. From my bedroom window on the second floor, I had a clear view of the field. Carlos would be out there for hours, bent over or climbing one of the wooden posts, hammer in hand. He didn't speak much, but he always gave a polite wave when he noticed me watching. That became kind of our thing. I'd sit at my desk after school, doing homework or sketching in my notebook, and he'd wave once or twice a day from somewhere in the rows. The first time I noticed something off, it was minor. One of the scarecrows had been moved slightly. Not much, just a couple of feet to the left. I chalked it up to wind, or maybe Carlos repositioning it for better visibility. But over the next week, a few more of them shifted subtly, sometimes overnight. I mentioned it to Wesley once. He didn't even look up from his coffee. "Carlos handles all that," he said. By the third week, I stopped bringing it up. I didn't want to seem paranoid. But every morning, I started making little pencil sketches of the field. Just a quick map with dots where each scarecrow stood. I kept the pages in a folder under my desk. And almost every other morning, at least one dot would be off. It was the night of the thunderstorm when things really changed. The sky turned almost purple around sunset, and the air got that weird electric feel. Rain started pounding the roof by 8 p.m. I was at my desk, trying to finish a history worksheet. The lightning was non-stop. Every few seconds the field would light up bright white, then go black again. I'd gotten used to the sight of the scarecrows, even in the flashes. But this time, something made me stop mid-sentence. I looked up just as another bolt lit the field. One of the scarecrows, it had been at the far corner of the field, closest to the woods, was gone. Not knocked over, not broken, just gone. I rubbed my eyes and stared harder into the dark. The next flash came and I scanned the same spot. Nothing there but rows of corn. But the weirdest part came in the flash after that. The scarecrow was back, but in a different place. Halfway down the row, maybe 20 feet closer to the house. Still standing, perfectly upright. I froze. I didn't move. I must have sat there like that for 10 minutes, watching the field. Each burst of lightning gave me another frame, like a broken flip book. The scarecrow never moved again. But it stayed in that new spot for the rest of the storm. I barely slept that night. I left the desk lamp on and tried to drown out the storm with headphones, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw that damn scarecrow blinking from place to place like it was playing some kind of game. When the sun finally came up, the storm was gone. I went outside after breakfast and walked along the edge of the field. Carlos was already out there, hammering something into the ground. I waited until he noticed me. He waved like always, and I waved back. Then I said, "Hey, did you have to fix any scarecrows this morning?" He looked confused. "No, why?" "I thought I saw one fall over last night during the storm." He chuckled, wiped his hands on his jeans. "Storms'll do that sometimes. Wind makes 'em lean." "But I didn't see any on the ground this morning." I nodded slowly. I could have sworn one moved. He laughed again, a little louder this time. "Yeah, the lightning messes with your eyes. Everything out here starts to look alive if you stare long enough." I didn't reply. He grabbed a piece of wood and walked back into the corn. I stayed there a bit longer, looking at the scarecrows. All of them stood perfectly still, arms out like always, clothes flapping slightly in the breeze. From that distance, it was impossible to tell which one had moved. But I knew it wasn't just the lightning. I'd seen it change places. I'd seen it disappear. Carlos went out to the field right after breakfast, the same way he did every morning, only this time he wasn't moving like usual. I watched from the porch steps, holding a chipped mug of coffee that Wesley let me start drinking on cold mornings. Carlos had his hands on his hips, staring at the empty post. He didn't touch anything at first, just stood there, tilting his head slightly, like he couldn't believe what he was looking at. After a few minutes, he crouched down and examined the base. I couldn't hear him from the porch, but I saw him shake his head slowly and then glance back toward the house. When he came inside, he went straight to the sink and splashed water on his face before saying anything. "That scarecrow's gone," he muttered, drying his hands on a dish towel. "Not just knocked over. It's not there." "The post?" I asked. "Still in the ground," he said. "Ropes still there. But no clothes, no stuffing, nothing. It's like it just stood up and walked away." Wesley didn't look up from his eggs. "Wind'll do that sometimes," he said. "Probably caught the shirt just right, yanked the whole thing off." Carlos didn't respond. He just leaned against the counter, arms crossed, eyes fixed on something far past the kitchen wall. That afternoon he went out back to the shed and built a new scarecrow. I watched him strip down one of the old flannel shirts, stuff it with hay, tie it off with twine. The whole time he was muttering to himself in Spanish, low and steady. When I brought him a glass of water, he stopped talking and gave me a half smile. But when I handed it to him, I noticed his hands were shaking. That night, I couldn't stop looking out the window. The replacement scarecrow was already up, standing in the exact spot the last one disappeared from. I counted the others too. 11, just like always. Nothing moved. Still, I pulled the curtains shut and moved my desk chair away from the glass, just in case. School was boring the next week. Same assignments, same cafeteria food, same kids who didn't care that I had moved here from a different world entirely. Most of them ignored me, except for the ones who found it funny that I wore sneakers instead of boots. I tried to lay low, keep my head down, but it didn't last long. On Wednesday, some loudmouth named Jesse started bragging to a group of kids by the lockers. Said he and a couple buddies had done something legendary during the storm. I wasn't paying attention until I heard the word scarecrow. Then my ears perked up. "Yeah," Jesse said, puffing his chest. "We went out there during the thunderstorm. Like idiots, I know. But we grabbed that ugly thing and dragged it off the post. Thought the city kid would crap his pants." Someone asked him what they did with it. He said they tore the thing apart and hung the shirt in his dad's barn. I stood there, frozen. One of the girls caught me staring and elbowed him. "Dude, that's the kid. From the farm." Jesse looked at me, then shrugged. "Hey, no hard feelings, right? Just a joke." When I told Wesley about it that night, he didn't get mad. He actually chuckled. "Kids are bored out here," he said. "A thunderstorm's the most excitement they've had in months." Carlos wasn't as amused. He stood in the corner of the kitchen, arms crossed, silent. The next day, Jesse and his friends showed up with a garbage bag full of burlap, buttons, and shredded flannel. His dad made him apologize face to face. Wesley accepted it, said boys will be boys, and even offered them lemonade. Carlos didn't say a word. Just took the bag and walked it out to the fire pit. For a couple days after that, things felt lighter. I stopped waking up in the middle of the night. Carlos stopped checking the scarecrows 3 times a day. It felt silly, almost embarrassing, how serious we'd taken the whole thing. But the truth is, we'd both believed something impossible had happened, and we'd acted like it too. I kept thinking about how my brain had filled in the blanks that night. I didn't just see a missing scarecrow. I imagined it walking, relocating, hiding between rows. My heart had raced, my palms had sweat, all because of an illusion my mind built on its own. The lightning, the storm, the shadows. It was all perfect fuel for the fire. I realized I'd never even gone into the field to check. I just looked through the glass and made up the rest. Carlos had done the same in his own way. Built a new scarecrow like he was replacing something vital. Slept with his flashlight under his pillow for 2 nights. We let fear stretch a small thing into something huge. Weeks passed, and things returned to normal. The corn kept growing. Carlos got back to his routine. I started spending more time helping around the farm, picking up the little stuff. Wesley never brought it up again. If he ever believed it was something more than a prank, he didn't show it. Looking back, that week taught me more than any textbook could. It wasn't just about scarecrows or storms. It was about how quickly logic can fall apart when fear takes over. How the mind, when left alone too long, starts writing its own stories. The real danger wasn't in the field. It was in how fast we stopped asking questions and started believing the worst. And that's what stuck with me. Not the scarecrow, not the prank. but how easy it was to forget what's real. How powerful suggestion becomes when you're isolated, when you're unsure. That's the part that still makes me uneasy. Not what I saw, but how quickly I believed it. I worked as a wildlife biologist conducting research in Everglades National Park for about 5 years. The job meant spending a lot of time alone in the field. Just me, a backpack full of gear, and days of cataloging animal behavior in places most tourists never even saw. I actually liked it that way. Some of the other biologists thought I was nuts for camping solo, but I preferred it. I liked the quiet, the long stretches where I didn't have to talk or think about anything but the environment around me. The Everglades is huge, with places so remote you can go a whole week without seeing another human being. One of my regular research areas was about a 2-day hike in from the nearest ranger station. I had a semi-permanent campsite set up on a slight rise, just out of reach from seasonal flooding, surrounded by a thick grove of slash pines and a few cypress. I kept a metal box there with extra supplies, and I knew the wildlife patterns so well in that area I could tell you what time the barred owls would start calling. Last spring, I hiked out like usual to begin a 10-day observation trip. When I got to my usual spot, I saw police tape strung between the trees and 2 uniformed officers standing near where I'd normally pitch my tent. I introduced myself and showed them my permit. They didn't stop me, just told me I couldn't be there. One of them said there'd been a missing tourist, some guy from out of state who vanished on a day hike. They were treating it as suspicious and had reason to think he might have been taken or worse. The other officer said, "Best to pick another site. Don't want to get in the way." I nodded and turned back, but as I walked away, I had this sudden, sharp memory that made me stop in my tracks. About 6 months earlier, I'd camped in that exact spot. It had been the dry season, cool and quiet. I'd fallen asleep early after a long day of tracking a group of river otters. Sometime deep in the night, I woke up suddenly. No noise, no dreams. Just awake. At first, I didn't hear anything unusual, but then I caught it. The sound of slow, heavy footsteps circling my tent. Not crunching through undergrowth like a raccoon or a deer. These were steady, human-like steps. 1, 2, pause. Then again, just around the perimeter of my tent. My first thought was that it might be a ranger checking on me, but it was too late for that, and they usually announced themselves anyway. I sat up, grabbed my flare gun, and called out through the fabric, "Who's there?" No response. What I got instead was a short, low chuckle. Definitely human, and it was nearby. It came from maybe 10 feet away, behind a patch of saw palmetto. The laughter didn't sound drunk or surprised or even nervous. It was slow, quiet, like whoever it was thought something was funny. My hand clenched tighter around the flare gun. I raised it and shot it straight into the sky. For a moment, the entire camp lit up red. Trees, brush, everything. I turned in every direction, trying to catch a glimpse of someone. Nothing. No one running, no one hiding. But I know what I heard. When the light faded, everything went quiet again. And those footsteps, they'd stopped. At the time, I convinced myself it had just been a couple of bored campers pulling a prank, or maybe someone drunk who had wandered off trail and ended up at my site by mistake. I stayed awake until morning with my knife in hand, just sitting there with my back against a tree and watching the dark for movement. But nothing happened. The rest of the night was dead silent, and when the sun finally came up, I forced myself to believe it was a weird but harmless encounter. I even wrote it off in my notes that day with a joke about midnight visitors and moved on. But standing there in front of the police tape, with the officers asking me questions about the area and a missing person possibly abducted, that memory hit different. My brain started playing back the sounds, those slow, careful steps, and that quiet laugh. The officers asked me if I'd seen anything unusual that night or the day before it. I told them I hadn't noticed any other people or vehicles nearby, but I gave them the exact date, coordinates, and what I remembered about the sound of the footsteps. They wrote everything down. One of them asked if I'd reported it at the time. I told him no. It hadn't seemed serious enough. He didn't say anything after that, just nodded and kept writing. The other officer told me they'd send someone to follow up if they needed more details. 2 weeks later, I was back home, sorting through data from a camera trap, when I got a call from the detective handling the missing tourist case. He introduced himself and thanked me for talking to the officers. Then he told me they'd made an arrest. A man had been caught a few miles from where I used to camp, trying to break into another camper's tent in the middle of the night. The camper was armed and chased him off. Rangers picked the guy up later that morning, hiding in dense brush near a creek. The man had no ID, no camping gear, nothing but a hunting knife and a plastic tarp. When they ran his prints, they found he was connected to at least 2 other disappearances in the area. The detective said he was a local, a drifter with a record for violent offenses and survivalist training. He had been living off the grid for over a year, hiding in remote corners of the Everglades, watching people who came in alone. The pattern was always the same. He would stalk his victims for hours, sometimes days, learning their schedules and how they moved. Then, when they were vulnerable, usually asleep, he would approach. He told me my case matched his methods exactly. The circling steps, the silence after being called out, even the strange laugh. The detective said the flare gun probably saved me. Most of his victims didn't make noise. They didn't wake up, he said. That sentence stuck with me. It hasn't left my head since. After that call, I went through every one of my old field notebooks, checking the dates and locations, looking for anything that seemed off, anything I might have missed. A few entries made me stop and think. Little things I hadn't considered before. A second set of footprints I chalked up to animals. A piece of bark that had been cleanly sliced off a tree near my tent. I realized how easy it had been to explain those things away when you don't want to believe something worse is happening. I haven't gone out alone since. That was a year ago. I still do field work, but only in pairs or with a team now. I carry a satellite phone, a GPS tracker, and an emergency beacon at all times. I also keep a canister of bear spray on my belt and a knife within reach when I sleep. I've become the kind of cautious I used to make fun of. Sometimes I think about how close I was. I had been sitting in my tent, half asleep, completely unaware that someone might have been standing just beyond the trees, watching me. Maybe he was waiting for me to go back to sleep. Maybe he'd already taken a few steps closer before I fired that flare. I'll never know. What keeps me up sometimes is how my mind tried to protect me by minimizing it. That night, even with everything telling me it wasn't right, the footsteps, the laugh, I still made excuses. I told myself it was a joke, a mistake, something not worth reporting. I believed it because the alternative was too frightening. Now, when I'm out in the field and something feels off, I trust it. I don't wait for proof. I don't wait for a sound to repeat or for something to appear. I pack up and I leave. I've learned that out in the wild, especially in places that feel untouched and silent, you're not always alone. And the scariest thing you can run into out there doesn't have claws or fangs. It has hands and eyes and a reason for being quiet. Last semester, my friends Madison, Ryan, and I decided to blow off some steam at a karaoke and arcade center near our Boston Tech College. It was one of those neon-lit places with private singing rooms, cheap food, and a half-broken Dance Dance Revolution machine tucked in the back corner. We hadn't hung out much since midterms, so it felt good just to be doing something stupid and loud again. It was Saturday night, and the place was packed. Music blasting from every direction, kids screaming over skee-ball scores, some guy butchering a Bon Jovi song in a booth to our left. The smell of pizza, sweat, and plastic tokens hung heavy in the air. We'd been there about an hour when suddenly everything went dark. It wasn't a full blackout, just enough to make people stop what they were doing. All the overhead lights cut out, leaving only faint red emergency strips glowing along the baseboards. The air conditioning stopped humming. Every karaoke screen in the place flicked off, leaving a dozen rooms full of people sitting in weird silence. For a second, nobody said anything. Then someone made a joke about the power company owing them a free round, and a few others laughed. I figured it was just a temporary glitch. But 5 minutes passed, and nothing changed. Madison got out her phone to turn on the flashlight, and that's when we noticed something weird. There weren't any staff around, no one behind the food counter, no one at the front check-in kiosk. Even the booth attendants had disappeared. You'd expect at least one employee to be walking around telling people what to do, or leading people out, or explaining the outage. But it was just empty. A few people started gathering by the front doors, squinting at their phones and whispering. Ryan said maybe they all went outside to check the fuse box or something, but even then, it didn't make sense for the entire staff to vanish without saying anything. I told them I was going to walk up front and see if there was anyone in the lobby. Madison came with me. The red lights lining the hall made the place feel like an emergency shelter or something. We passed 2 other customers heading in the same direction, both of them frowning and glancing around like they were trying to figure out what they'd missed. At the front counter, it was completely empty. Not just the people, everything. The food station was closed up, the popcorn machine off, no sound, no movement. The cash registers were still glowing faintly, running off battery backups maybe, but no employees were around to use them. I leaned over and called out, "Hello?" No answer. The office doors behind the counter were shut. Madison knocked on one. Nothing. We walked around back behind the podium area, where a hallway led to what I assumed were staff-only rooms, but it was locked. The door had a swipe card slot, but even the little light on it wasn't blinking anymore. Ryan showed up a minute later, saying he checked the game side and didn't see a single employee either. We all stood there, confused, trying to figure out how an entire business could just go dark and empty in the middle of a packed Saturday night. Then Madison checked her phone again and frowned. "Guys," she said, "did you get this?" She showed me her screen. Nothing new had come in. Ryan shook his head too. But she had a notification from about 20 minutes earlier, an automated safety alert saying the building's fire alarm system had experienced a critical error and instructed everyone to evacuate immediately. Her screen had a blinking yellow banner at the top. It looked legit. Ryan refreshed his signal, and suddenly his phone buzzed with the same alert. Mine did too, once we walked a few feet closer to the front door. The app said a sensor failure had triggered a fire warning in multiple zones of the building, and as a precaution the evacuation protocol had gone live, instructing staff and customers to exit through the side stairwells. It had even included a link to a QR code for safe exit locations across the parking lot. Somehow, because we'd been down in the lower karaoke level, our phones hadn't caught the signal until we moved upstairs. We hadn't heard any alarms, no flashing lights, no staff guiding people out. But it explained why everyone else was suddenly gone. The emergency lighting was probably tied into the same system, just a fallback until someone came back to reset the controls. Ryan opened the front door, but it was already locked from the outside, probably an automatic part of the lockdown mode. When we tried the fire exit near the restrooms, it pushed open with some effort, creaking as if it hadn't been used in years. That door led into a narrow stairwell that smelled like wet drywall and dust. We still didn't see anyone. No staff waiting outside. No cops. No fire trucks. No one coming back to check the building. We walked back to the lobby, trying to decide what to do next. Ryan said he didn't want to split up. Madison agreed. I looked toward the long hallway where the karaoke rooms were and realized we hadn't seen anyone else in a while. The place had been full. Families, couples, big groups. But it was like everyone had just disappeared. I asked, "Did you guys actually see people leave? Like walk out?" They both said no. Madison looked back toward the gaming area. They were just gone when we looked up. That was the last thing any of us said for a while. The emergency lighting cast weird shadows throughout the arcade area, making everything feel off. The air hockey tables looked like stretchers under those red lights, and the old claw machine in the corner clicked and hummed like it was breathing. The familiar buzzing and jingling from the arcade games had died completely, but there were still faint mechanical noises. We tried the main exit again, even yanked the handles, but the door stayed locked. Ryan kicked it once out of frustration and just ended up cursing under his breath. The fire exits were all sealed too. No crash bars, no open mechanisms, just flat metal and unlit panels where the locks should have disengaged. It made no sense. Emergency exits shouldn't seal during an evacuation. Madison kept checking her phone, walking in circles near the front entrance, probably hoping her signal would come back. We figured we'd try the service hallway next, hoping maybe a back door had been missed during the lockdown. As we moved through the center, that mechanical sound got louder. It wasn't a machine powering down, not like before. It was this slow, rhythmic whirring and bumping, like something rolling back and forth. We followed it into the arcade room. There, under the flickering red light strips, we saw it. A robotic vacuum gliding slowly across the scuffed floor between game machines. It was one of those small disc-shaped ones you see at airports, quiet and steady. It made a soft clunk when it bumped into a toppled stool near the photo booth, then gently rotated and kept moving. The lights on top still blinked green. It was working like nothing had happened. The weirdest part? Everything else had shut down, but this thing was still running. At first we didn't think much of it, just another machine doing its job. But as we moved through the halls looking for an exit, we kept hearing it. It wasn't loud, just persistent. A low hum, followed by a soft bump, then a change in direction. Over and over. It felt like it was following us. Once, when we passed through the snack bar seating area, it rounded a corner behind us and came to a full stop. Just sat there, silent. Then the moment we turned away, we heard it spin and continue along its path. We tried to ignore it, but the layout of the place wasn't helping. The corridors didn't loop like we thought. Some doors were locked. Some led back to areas we'd already searched. Madison said it felt like being stuck inside a maze that kept shifting. The vacuum sound got louder again, closer this time. We ducked into the party room, hoping to find a window, or at least a phone line. Nothing. Just empty tables and leftover balloons half deflated, swaying in the airflow from ceiling vents that had long since stopped pushing air. Ryan found a staff map posted by the kitchen. It showed a loading dock behind the building with a marked service door. It wasn't far. We cut through a supply hallway, moving faster now. The robot sound faded behind us, but every time we stopped, it felt like it was getting closer again. Not fast, never fast. Just always moving, always working. We found the service door wedged halfway open. One of the hydraulic arms had failed, and it sat crooked in the frame like someone had forced it open from the outside. Cold night air spilled in from the gap. We didn't hesitate. We pushed through, stumbled out onto the concrete platform, and kept walking until we reached the edge of the lot. Only then did I turn back. The building looked quiet, still. No movement inside the darkened windows. But I could hear that soft humming, just barely, drifting out through the open service door. We left $20 on the front desk before we exited, folded under a coaster from the karaoke room. A few days later, someone from the center called me. They had our contact info from our booking, and they were trying to do damage control. The guy on the phone apologized for what he called an unfortunate sequence of system failures. He explained the fire alarm system had a software fault that caused it to send out a false evacuation signal. When that happened, their internal safety policy required all employees to leave the building and wait for emergency responders before re-entry. He said the evacuation text alerts had reached most of the patrons, but there was a known coverage issue in the lower floors, which explained why we didn't get the warning until we came upstairs. He kept saying how rare the glitch was, how unlikely it was to happen again. They were upgrading the system, he said, adding internal PA announcements, better coverage, a manual override in case of future faults. He also offered us each a free month of visits, no expiration. I told him we appreciated the call. I never took the free month. None of us did. We stopped talking about it after a while, but something about that place stuck with me. Not the darkness, or the alarms, or the silence after everyone left. It was that cleaning robot. The way it kept going like nothing was wrong. Like it didn't need people to give it instructions anymore. It didn't ask where everyone went. It just kept working. Now, whenever I walk through malls or stations and see those robots gliding across floors, I always glance around first. I look for exits. I check my phone signal. And I don't stay too long in any place where the machines keep moving after all the people are gone. When I was 29, I worked as a translator for an international NGO in DC. The job itself wasn't bad, steady hours, decent pay. But what really mattered to me was getting closer to family. I'd been living in the city for almost 6 years and barely saw my parents, who were still in Ohio. My sister had moved to Hungary for work, and I hadn't seen her in over 2 years. So when a position opened up in Eastern Europe, I jumped on it. It meant uprooting everything: apartment, social life, even my gym routine. But the idea of being a train ride away from my sister was more than enough to make it worth it. There was just one hurdle. To qualify for the transfer, I needed to pass a translation certification, which involves submitting 2 translated policy documents within 4 days. They weren't long, but the language was dense and formal. I locked myself in my apartment for 3 days, barely stepping out except for coffee and some quick groceries. I worked on a printed version of the documents with a red pen in hand, checking and rechecking every paragraph, then typing out the final draft on my laptop, paragraph by paragraph, constantly flipping back and forth between the original and the translation. I finished around 9:30 the night before they were due. After double-checking the formatting and converting both files into PDFs, I saved everything onto my work laptop and loaded both the translated files and my original notes into a zipped folder. Then I placed both printed translations, the ones I'd annotated and finalized, into my work bag along with my laptop. The bag was one of those simple black shoulder bags with a flap and Velcro closure. Nothing fancy but reliable. I slid it under the coat rack by the front door before brushing my teeth and crashing into bed, exhausted but relieved. The next morning, I got up at 6. I wanted to be at the office early to submit everything before my 9 a.m. shift started. While waiting for my coffee to brew, I went over my packing list mentally. Laptop, documents, badge, wallet. I grabbed my bag and felt the weight of it, lighter than I expected. That was the first clue. I opened the flap and saw my laptop and one of the printed translations inside. But the second document was gone. At first, I figured it must have slipped between the laptop sleeve or gotten stuck to the inside pocket. I took everything out and laid it on the kitchen table. Pens, charger, laptop, folder. Nothing. I checked the floor around the bag. Then I looked under the coat rack. I went back into my bedroom, opened every drawer. I checked the bathroom, even the fridge. I was that desperate. I lifted every cushion on the couch and looked behind the TV stand. By 7:15, I was sweating through my shirt and still hadn't found it. I ran downstairs to my car and checked the trunk and the back seat, even though I hadn't used the car since Monday. Nothing. I rushed back upstairs, convinced it had to be somewhere stupid. Maybe it slipped behind the dresser, or I absent-mindedly put it on the kitchen counter with the mail. Still nothing. It was like it vanished. By 8:10, I gave up searching and drove to the office, hoping maybe I'd accidentally left it at my desk. I parked in the usual lot, grabbed my bag, and half ran through security. I checked my desk drawers, every file folder, every tray. I went over to the copy machine area where I remembered printing an earlier draft, pulled open the bin under the scanner, and even checked behind the paper shredder. Nothing. When my supervisor came in, I explained everything. He was understanding but confused. He told me not to panic, that the original source article should be saved on the internal server. So we went to his office and tried to locate the file using keywords. Nothing came up. He brought in someone from IT who ran a deeper search. No result. They checked my access logs and confirmed I'd opened the document 2 days earlier. But the system showed no existing copy of the original file anymore. Not in my account, not in the shared drive, not in backups. It was like the file had never existed. I asked if they could retrieve a previous version from cache, or even use system restore points. They said their current policy automatically deletes cached files every 48 hours. My last access had been 54 hours ago. I even asked if they had an auto-save on the shared folder, and they said the folder in question hadn't been configured for versioning. Without the original source document, I couldn't redo the translation. I had the English version I'd written, but not the original Hungarian text. No one else had a copy either. The staff member who'd sent it out was on leave, and their inbox had already auto-cleared for the quarter. I called my sister to ask if she could help me track down the article or a similar document, but she had no idea what I was talking about. She said she'd never seen the one I described and wasn't even sure where I could have gotten it. I didn't mention that I'd been sure I found it on the NGO's internal archive, because at that point I wasn't sure of anything. I ended up sitting in the break room for half an hour, staring at the wall, trying to figure out if I'd somehow deleted the file myself, or imagined saving it in the first place. That didn't make sense. I had my handwritten notes and printouts, which clearly referenced both translations side by side. I had marked corrections and written "final" in red pen on both. Only one remained. I called HR around lunchtime. I wanted to explain what happened, just lay it out clearly and see if there was any room to fix it. The woman who answered was polite, but the longer I talked, the more I could hear her tone change. I explained that I'd finished both translations, printed them out, saved the files, and packed everything carefully. I told her one document vanished from my apartment, and the original source file was missing from the server too. She asked if I had any backup, maybe a screenshot or an email thread that referenced the original text. I didn't. I could feel her skepticism. She didn't say she didn't believe me, but I could tell. She repeated that late submissions weren't accepted, even in cases of technical issues. Policy was policy. I asked to speak to her supervisor. There was a pause before she transferred me. The next voice was calm, professional, but firm. She said the decision had already been made to move forward with other candidates. They'd had over 20 complete submissions and couldn't make exceptions. I said I understood. I didn't argue. I thanked her and ended the call. Then I just sat there at my desk with the phone in my hand for a long time, staring at nothing. That evening I called my sister. She already knew something was wrong from my tone. I told her what happened, how the document disappeared, and how the file was gone from the server. She didn't say much at first. Then she asked if there was any chance I could still apply for another transfer in the future. I said maybe. She sounded disappointed but didn't press. Before we hung up, she said, "I was really looking forward to seeing you more." I told her I was sorry. I meant it. After that, I just went back to work. I buried myself in it. I stayed late most nights and said yes to anything that landed on my desk. Reports, back translations, internal memos, didn't matter. I wanted to stay busy. My manager noticed. A few colleagues asked if I was okay, but I just said I was keeping my mind occupied. People were sympathetic at first. Then the tone shifted. I caught a coworker rolling her eyes when someone brought up the Europe transfer. One guy asked me quietly if I was really sure I'd translated both documents. I laughed it off, but it stuck with me. The worst part was that I didn't even know what had gone wrong. Maybe I had lost it. Maybe I'd never saved the file. I started questioning myself. One night after work, I grabbed a drink with someone from our French desk, Anya. She'd heard the whole story. She said, "Maybe part of you didn't want to go." I looked at her. She shrugged. Sometimes we sabotage ourselves when we're afraid. Change is scary. I told her that wasn't it, that I'd really wanted to move. She just nodded like she didn't believe me, or maybe she didn't want to argue. But that line stayed with me. The next few days, I kept replaying everything, packing my bag, checking the files, the feeling of something missing in the morning. What if I had just messed up? What if some part of me did it on purpose? By the second month, I stopped talking about it. No one brought it up anymore. Work went back to normal. I still stayed late, but more out of habit than anything else. One Thursday morning, I was walking into the building when I noticed a cluster of people standing around a TV in the lobby. The sound was off, but I saw the headline. Armed conflict had erupted in the region where the new branch office had opened. The footage showed smoke rising from the edge of a city and people running for cover. I stopped walking. I stood there and watched for a while, reading the scrolling text at the bottom. NGO staff had been evacuated within 48 hours. 3 employees were injured when their convoy hit an IED during extraction. The camera cut to a damaged vehicle, twisted metal, broken windows. That night I went online and found a statement from the organization. The staff injuries were serious but not fatal. One of them was listed as the supervisor who would have been mine. He'd been airlifted to a military hospital. Multiple fractures, surgery, recovery still uncertain. I stared at the screen, reading the sentence twice. My stomach turned. The next few days were strange. I didn't talk to anyone about it. I didn't mention it to my coworkers, didn't call my sister. I just kept thinking about that missing translation, that file that vanished, That printout that was there one night and gone the next. The bag, the folder, the digital trace that just disappeared. I thought about the hours I'd spent tearing my apartment apart, cursing myself, panicking over what felt like the biggest screw-up of my career. And now, it looked like that screw-up might have saved my life. There's no way to prove anything. I don't believe in fate. But I know this. If I had submitted both translations, if the file hadn't disappeared, I would have gotten the job. I would have moved to that city. I would have been in one of those trucks. Every time I think about the bomb, I remember standing in my kitchen that morning, pulling everything out of my work bag, trying to figure out how a document could vanish into thin air. I used to think that moment was the worst thing that had happened to me professionally. Now I'm not so sure. Sometimes failure isn't failure. Sometimes it's just something stopping you before you walk straight into danger. And sometimes it takes a long time before you understand why something had to go wrong. When I was 15, we lived in a quiet suburb about 30 miles outside Detroit. It was October 29th, 2014, around 9 p.m. when our dog Max started going crazy. He kept barking at the back window and scratching at the glass like something was really bothering him outside. I figured it was probably a raccoon or possum in our yard. Our house backed up to a golf course, so we got wildlife sometimes. I walked over to see what had him so worked up. That's when I saw 3 bright green lights hovering over the road behind our house. They weren't just flickering like plane lights or moving in a straight line like you'd expect from a helicopter. These things were totally still, just hovering there like basketball-sized orbs about 12 feet off the ground. I pressed my face closer to the window. The lights looked almost fluorescent, kind of pulsing a little, and they made no sound at all. It was like the air around them was completely still too. I thought maybe it was some kind of drone setup, but I'd never seen any drone move like that, especially not back in 2014, before they were everywhere. I opened the sliding door to the deck and stepped outside. Max was still barking like mad, the fur on his back standing up. He was fixated on those lights. I grabbed his collar and held him back. The cold air hit me, and the sky above was totally clear. You could see stars, the full moon lighting up the whole backyard. But those lights didn't match anything I'd ever seen in the sky before. They were too close, too stable, and just wrong somehow. The lights started shifting positions, not erratically, just slowly, with this perfect kind of formation, like they were linked together. They moved side to side, then started a slow up and down motion, almost like they were scanning the area below. There was still no sound, not even the hum of electronics or air movement. Max whimpered and tried to pull away from me. Then something happened that still makes my stomach twist when I think about it. The lights suddenly stopped moving and locked into a perfectly straight line, like a ruler had lined them up. They hovered there for maybe 3 seconds. Then all 3 shot straight up into the sky at the exact same moment. I mean straight up, no curve, no delay between them. 1 second they were there, and the next they were gone, just like someone had erased them. There was no sound, no trail, no blinking, just silence. I stood there frozen for a full minute, holding Max's collar, my breath fogging in the cold air. I remember looking around the neighborhood to see if any lights had come on, like maybe someone else had seen it. But the houses were all dark. Nothing moved. Even Max stopped barking. I let go of him, and he just stood there, tail down, staring at the sky. I went back inside and locked the door behind me. The lights hadn't looked like any aircraft I knew. They didn't move like anything I'd ever seen before. I didn't say anything to my parents that night. I just went upstairs and sat on my bed, staring out the window for hours. I didn't see anything else. But I stayed up till dawn, just in case they came back. They never did. I called my sister Chloe over to the window, but the lights were already gone. She thought I was making it up until they came back 10 minutes later. This time we turned off all the lights in the house so we could watch without being seen. The three objects were hovering over the golf course now, doing the same up and down scanning motion. Chloe grabbed her phone and started recording, but the video quality was terrible in the darkness. We could barely make out the green glow on the screen. They hovered slowly, perfectly steady, maybe 30 feet above one of the putting greens. Max had started barking again, but this time he stayed pressed up against the back door. His tail was tucked, his body low. The whole thing felt wrong. We didn't say a word, just crouched by the window and watched. Every few seconds the lights would rise and fall together in this mechanical rhythm, almost like they were sweeping for something. Chloe whispered, "Why is there no sound?" And I had no answer. Then just like before, the lights froze mid-air, lined up in a perfect row, and shot straight up into the sky. It was so fast you almost missed it. Chloe gasped and looked down at her phone, but the footage just looked like static and darkness. She played it back, scrubbing through the video, but nothing clear showed up. Just faint glowing blurs. "They're messing with our signals," she said. I didn't answer. My eyes were still on the empty sky. After they disappeared, Chloe and I stayed at the window for another hour, but they didn't come back. We debated whether to tell our parents, but decided they'd think we were making it up. The house was quiet again. Max had curled up in the corner of the kitchen, and neither of us wanted to be the one to break the silence. I went upstairs and lay in bed with the blinds open, staring out into the backyard. The next day at school, I mentioned it to a few friends, but nobody believed me. One guy said it was probably just remote control helicopters, but I knew that wasn't right. These things moved like nothing I'd ever seen before. No blades, no blinking lights, no buzzing noise. Another friend said maybe it was just a drone with a custom LED setup. I nodded, pretending to agree, but inside I knew what we saw didn't match anything like that. They moved too precisely, too perfectly timed. Later that week, Chloe tried uploading the video to YouTube, but it barely got any views. She deleted it after a few days, frustrated that the one clear experience we'd had meant nothing to anyone else. "Nobody's going to believe it," she said. I agreed. We stopped talking about it at home. It started to feel like maybe it hadn't happened at all. But every time I passed the back window, I looked out at the golf course. It was empty now, yellow leaves scattered across the grass, frost forming on the edges of the pond near the 16th hole. A few weeks later, I was reading online about military drone testing and found articles about new experimental aircraft being developed. There was an Air Force base about 50 miles from our house where they tested new technology. I figured that's probably what Chloe and I had witnessed that night. The green lights were likely some kind of new navigation or targeting system they were testing in rural areas. It made sense that they'd use our quiet neighborhood since there weren't many people around to see them. One article mentioned high-speed aerial vehicles being tested with silent propulsion systems. It described how new military craft were being designed with cloaking features and silent vertical lift. The descriptions weren't exact, but it was the closest thing I'd found to explaining what we saw. I bookmarked it and sent it to Chloe. She didn't reply for a day, then just texted, "Makes sense." We never saw those lights again. Halloween came and went, then winter. The golf course closed for the season, and our yard stayed quiet. Max stopped barking at the windows, and we went back to normal life. But sometimes I'd look up at the sky when walking home or glance out the window at night, hoping maybe they'd return. They didn't. But I still wonder what kind of advanced drone technology we accidentally witnessed that night. It felt like getting a glimpse of something not meant to be seen, something years ahead of what's publicly available, maybe even decades. And that's the part that still sticks with me. Not just what we saw, but that we weren't supposed to see it. Sometimes you witness something that changes the way you look at the sky, and even when it's gone, you keep looking. When I was 22, I came home for winter break to my parents' house in a quiet suburb just north of San Diego. It was one of those neighborhoods where all the houses look like variations of the same model. Lawns trimmed tight, everyone drives a crossover SUV, and the streetlights flick on automatically at dusk. My parents had lived there since I was in middle school. Same neighbors, same routines, same everything. It was the kind of place that felt stuck in time. They kept my room just like I left it. Second floor, corner of the house, window facing the backyard. I'd started working as a freelance software developer during college, so I had this habit of coding deep into the night. Headphones on, browser tabs full of GitHub and Stack Overflow, and endless cups of coffee. My sleep schedule was a mess, but my parents were used to it. I'd usually go to bed around 3 or 4 a.m. and sleep until noon. To avoid waking them up, I kept things quiet. My desk lamp was dim. I used noise-canceling headphones. I'd crack the window open just enough for the cold air to circulate, since I didn't want to run the fan and risk it buzzing all night. The window faced the backyard, which was separated from the neighbor's place by a 6-foot wood fence. From my chair, I could see down into our yard, the patio furniture, the patchy grass, and the sliding glass door leading to the kitchen. The neighborhood was dead silent after 9 p.m. Everyone went to sleep early. Families with young kids, retirees, people who didn't keep the kind of schedule I had. It made it easy to focus. The quiet felt absolute. No barking dogs, no traffic, just the low hum of my computer and the occasional creak of the house settling. My dad had installed a pretty solid home security system the previous year, after someone broke into a house 2 streets over. Door sensors, motion detectors, glass break sensors, and cameras on each entry point. There was even an app connected to all of it so he could check from his phone, which he did constantly. I wasn't worried about staying up late, even with the window cracked. If anything moved outside, we'd know. My first 2 nights back were completely uneventful. I'd stay up working until around 2:30, then crash hard. No noise, no interruptions. On the 3rd night, things changed. I was deep into a debugging session, trying to get some function to stop throwing null values when the alarm went off. It was just past 1 a.m. The sound was deafening. That high-pitched wailing from every floor, pulsing red lights on the control panel downstairs. It jolted me out of my chair and probably woke the entire block. I pulled off my headphones and bolted to the window. The backyard was dim, the porch light casting shadows across the patio. I scanned the whole yard, heart racing, but I didn't see anything. No movement, nothing out of place. Footsteps thundered below. My dad sprinted past the hallway, heading for the keypad next to the front door. I heard the beeping as he disarmed the system, and then his voice, loud but steady, calling to my mom that it was the backdoor sensor. I slipped on my hoodie and went downstairs. He was already grabbing the flashlight from the drawer. I opened the sliding glass door and stepped out onto the cold patio. The air hit hard, dry and crisp. My dad moved past me, sweeping the beam of the flashlight over the fence, the bushes, the side gate. He didn't say much, Just short words, muttered to himself, checking each corner of the yard like he'd done this before. The back door was still locked. The sensor showed it had been triggered, but there were no signs of forced entry. No scratches, no dents, not even a loose hinge. My mom stood inside with her arms crossed, half wrapped in a blanket. I saw her glance at the security app on her phone, then at my dad. "Could have been the wind," he said. "That door's been sticking lately. Might have shifted." He went back in to reset the system and check the log timestamps. The sensor had tripped at exactly 1:03 a.m. Nothing else had gone off. No motion sensors, no cameras, nothing. Just the back door. I stayed outside for another minute, looking at the fence line. The neighbor's backyard was dark. Their porch light was off. Nothing moved. I checked the gate one more time. Still latched. Still locked. We didn't talk much after that. My dad double-checked the rest of the house. I went back upstairs and stared out the window for a while before sitting down at my desk again. I didn't put my headphones back on. Instead, I kept the window closed, just slightly ajar now. I worked in silence until the sky started turning pale gray. About 30 minutes after everything calmed down, just as I'd finally started dozing off again, the alarm screamed through the house a second time. Same sound, same red lights. I shot up off the couch, heart pounding. My dad was already halfway down the stairs when I met him in the hallway. Same sensor, back door again. He didn't even check outside this time. Just stared at the control panel and rubbed his eyes. "It's probably the door again," he said. "It sticks. We'll just disable that zone for the night." I could tell he was trying to be calm, maybe not scare my mom, but he was irritated. Frustrated more than worried. I offered to stay on the couch and keep watch. Figured if someone really was out there, I'd rather be awake than hear about it later. He didn't argue. Just handed me the remote for the security monitor, tapped in the code, and disabled the backdoor sensor. The rest of the house went quiet again. I sat in the dark living room with the curtains open and the monitor lit in front of me. The camera showed the backyard. Same grainy, flickering feed we'd always had. A section of lawn, the glass door, the fence. I stared at it non-stop. Every rustle of a tree or flicker of a shadow made me lean forward, squinting. But nothing moved. No people, no animals, no reason for the door to have triggered. And yet I had this pressure in my chest like something was wrong, like we'd missed something. The hour passed slow. The heater kicked on. A car drove by once, but inside the house, it stayed silent. I never left my spot on the couch. Just watched, listened, waited. The next morning, my dad poured himself a cup of coffee and opened the security app. He scrolled through the event history while I stood across from him. It didn't take long before he stopped mid-sip, eyes fixed on the screen. "What is it?" I asked. He turned the phone toward me. The log showed motion at the back door. 12:48, 1:02, 1:15, then more, 1:30, 1:42, all the way down the list, 18 separate triggers, all while we were either asleep or sitting in that living room with a supposedly deactivated sensor. He hadn't checked the log after disabling it. That's why we hadn't heard the other alerts. They were still registering silently in the system. "That doesn't make sense," he muttered. "It shouldn't trigger if it's disabled." But it had. Repeatedly. Later that afternoon, someone knocked at our front door. It was Mrs. Patterson, our neighbor from 2 houses over. She looked tired, a little nervous. Her hands were buried deep in her coat pockets. "Sorry to bother," she said, "but I thought I should show you this." She held out her phone and played a video clip. Black and white, low resolution, time-stamped 12:53 a.m., her side yard camera. It showed our shared fence line, dim porch light casting just enough glow to see movement. A figure, slim, hunched, walking slowly along the fence behind our house. They paused, backed up, approached again. Then the clip ended. "There's more," she said. "Same person walked back and forth maybe 5 or 6 times. Around the time your alarm went off, I guess." I felt my throat tighten. My dad thanked her, asked if she'd mind sending the files over. She nodded and left, glancing up and down the street as she walked back. That evening, we called the police. An officer came by within the hour. Young guy, mid-30s maybe. He watched the video, asked some questions, took notes. "Seen this before," he said. "It's called probing. They'll trigger alarms to see how fast people react, figure out if there's a dog, anyone up late, stuff like that. Most likely they're testing your system, learning what parts of the house are covered." "But why our house?" my mom asked. The officer shrugged. "Could be random, could be opportunity. Some of these guys keep notebooks, logs of patterns when lights go on, what cars come and go. If you've got a blind spot or a sensor that gives false positives, that becomes the entry point." There wasn't much they could do. No face on camera, no license plate, no sign of forced entry. Just the eerie pattern of someone pacing the backyard, quietly, methodically, while we slept. My dad didn't wait. That night we went to Home Depot and bought 2 more floodlights, battery backups, and upgraded cameras with color night vision. By the end of the week, there were motion sensors on every window and door, and a second lock installed on both entry points. Even the side gate got reinforced with a steel latch. Nothing ever happened again. Not during the rest of winter break, not after I returned to college, not even the following year. But that hasn't helped me sleep better, because someone had spent hours watching us, studying our routines, testing responses, mapping our house like they were preparing for something bigger. And we wouldn't have known, wouldn't have even suspected, if not for one sensor being just a little too sensitive. Sometimes I still wake up around 1 a.m. and check the camera feed on my phone. I tell myself it's a habit, but I think it's fear. The kind that lingers after you realize how easily a locked door and a quiet night can make you feel safe, when they really shouldn't.